Hello, everyone.
Howdy, howdy.
Hello.
Welcome.
Yes. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
We're going to give everyone a minute to trickle in. I'm going to put my phone on silent.
Oh, good reminder.
Yeah.
We do the same. I did tell all of my children that they were not allowed to call me.
We'll see if they listen.
I also told my husband he was not allowed to call me, but you will see how that goes.
Yeah, Shane knows about this, but Shane may call me. So
we're definitely not a calling family. It's like you either text or you don't. So,
so no worries there.
Yeah, no.
Okay. All right. Let me figure out what I'm doing here. Show on stage.
Welcome to everybody who's here watching. So glad to see you. If you haven't yet, please give us a like and a follow on all of our social media. So we're on all of them. There are so many of them now, but no, the big ones like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube. If you haven't followed us on YouTube, please give us a follow there too.
Oh, I don't think I followed you on Instagram yet. I'm gonna have to go find that one.
We're there.
I know. I'm a delinquent. I will. I'll get it together.
I am. Hold on one second. I am still struggling here, and I may need my tech support. Jack. Yeah. Come here.
It's a Friday. It's the end of the week.
Yes.
It has been a week.
How do I get back to full screen? There we go. Thanks.
Click.
Yes. That's why you have children. You have children for these moments when you're like, oh, what do I do? Are we live? We're live.
Are you unlisted?
Oh, we're unlisted. God darn it. We're live, but we're unlisted. Okay, hold on.
Do you want me to handle that?
Can you?
Don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know.
Okay, so we're unlisted.
No, we're not. I got it.
You got it. Okay.
I don't even know what it means to be unlisted.
Okay. We're good. We're good. We're awesome. We're ready to go.
Hello, everyone.
Ready.
After some technical difficulties, we're back. And
what would it be?
If hopefully you can hear us okay. If you can't, please throw a comment in the comment box. Apologies for the delay in getting to you. We had a little glitch and then we figured it out and it's all good. It's Friday. It's Friday and I'm ready for it to be Friday. So if you're a CPST and you're joining us, even if you're not a CPST, if you want to throw a comment in the comments box and let us know where you're tuning in from on this lovely Friday evening.
We were just talking about this before you got on. I'm in upstate New York, which is currently in the season of cold rain and mud. It's lovely.
I mean, it beats ice and snow. And you know what else it beats? Tornadoes. So if any of you are in the path of some really awful storms this week, we are sorry about that. And we hope that everyone is safe and that your weather improves.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you know, mud is not great, but tornadoes, yeah.
That's fair.
Somebody who lives in the Northeast. And actually, Louisa, you had a tornado incident in your last class last year.
So it's kind of become a running joke that you don't want to go anywhere with me because I'm a magnet for natural disasters. Had a class with an earthquake, a class with a tornado, a class with a blizzard in like April, a heat wave. I don't remember what month that was,
That
but
was
I mean,
June. That was our stack training in June last year, where it was like 100
yeah,
degrees at 8 o'clock in the morning.
I haven't hit a dust storm or a volcano yet. So those are still possibilities.
As
But
are the
yeah,
swarm of locust.
no, I reject that one. Bugs and I are not cool.
Yes, but you did have a tornado, and it was a bit of a challenge because it happened in the middle of a class. Well, not the actual tornado, but like it took out power in the area.
Actually,
And
Jack and Liz and I were still in the classroom when it started. We were just wrapping up when all of the alarms started going off. So
Wow.
yeah, and it messed up our classroom and our catering. But you know, there were certainly people that had far more devastation than we did. So we were thankful that all of our students were okay.
Louisa,
Wow.
I do think that your teaching team is going to have to sign waivers, though, before every class saying that they agree to, yeah.
I may or may not have had an instructor come with a life jacket and I think air horn to the last one because he was aware of the reputation and wanted to be prepared. So
I think there was a fire extinguisher as well.
I
Did he
believe
show
you're
up with a fire
correct.
extinguisher? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, our weather. Heather, how is your weather in Vegas?
Windy and cold.
And what is
spring.
cold?
60 degrees. I mean, it's cold. Next week it'll be 90.
Right. It's cold for Vegas.
It is. I mean, it didn't get to 60 yesterday. So I mean, it's cold. It's cold. Like
especially if it's windy. Then
heater came on, cold. So this is not our weather. Yeah.
well, but
Renee,
in a couple of
we
weeks.
luckily have. Oh, I was just
No,
going to call out Renee and say we've luckily avoided wildfires in this area, but we did have smoke from the Canadian wildfires at some point. I don't know if you had that in Spokane, but that was rough here too. Yeah.
Oh,
I wish people would not ring my doorbell. Sorry.
yeah. All right, we're going to get started in a few minutes, and I think we'll start with some introductions. Heather and I will introduce ourselves, and then we will have our esteemed colleagues introduce themselves. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Keisha Healy. I'm a child passenger safety technician instructor in the Hudson Valley, New York area, and I have been a technician for a minute or two. I've been an instructor for, some people like to talk about how long they've been doing things, and I don't like to talk about how long I've been doing things because, but no, listen, it's going to be 20 years this year of being an instructor. I became an instructor in like late October of 2005. So October of this year will be 20 years of being an instructor. And I am stack trained. I have the pleasure of tailing Louisa around and helping out with the stack trainings in New York. I learn something new all the time. I mean, every class, I'm just absorbing some information, and this is our agenda, or no, that's not the one I'm looking for, but our hope for this live stream is that technicians will leave here with a sense of empowerment that they can also help families in their communities, even if you don't have stack training, right? For a long time, I did not have stack training, and I was still willing to help families in my community. So really the most important thing is a willingness and a desire to help, along with a heap of other stuff. So we're going to get to all of that, but I'll let Heather introduce herself, and then Gary and Louisa can introduce themselves.
Hey, I'm Heather. And yeah, I'm a year behind Keisha as an instructor. I've been an instructor since 2006, so 19 years, and a tech since 2001. So a long time. And like she said, at this point, we don't like to talk about how many years that is. That's a long time. And it's like I have the stack training as well, but I think I helped a caregiver probably 6 months after I had the stack training, and I haven't been able to put it into use since then. So it's something that I think unless you really work with it a lot on on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis, that you get really rusty on it really quick. It's just, I don't see it. So, but I'm willing to get out there and help. And so this is a really interesting topic to me, just because, it's not just the physical things that we see with kids. There are behavioral issues and all kinds of things that we come across both online and in person that we need to know about. So this is a really interesting topic. And I'm glad to see familiar faces too, or familiar names here too. So
yes, thank you everyone who is joining us. All right, let's start with Gary. Dr. Gary Scales, would you like to introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about you and what you are doing currently?
Yeah, of course. First of all, hello to everyone who's joining us, and a big thanks to Keisha and Heather, obviously, for inviting me here. So this was a wonderful chance to participate, answer questions directly. For those of you who don't know, I'm a design engineer at Merit Manufacturing. So for those of you who know, as the company may know Shane, and I work directly under Shane. I am a CPST, soon to be a Stack I candidate as well. So work a lot of the time with these sorts of things. So in a sense, kind of the opposite to what Heather was saying. I participate in the usual car seat checks locally, but see a lot of stuff as well, working with the hospitals that we do. And I was at Temple University's Institute on Disabilities for 2 years while I was doing my study. So that's kind of the route that took me here. And very happy to be here, and hopefully can answer some questions and put some lasting information out there. And as Keisha said, just speak to the empowerment of what this kind of knowledge can do for you in your role as a CPST.
Fabulous. Oh, no, wait. Brilliant.
It's a good word. I like it.
It is a good word. And I feel like Americans don't take advantage of that good word often enough. So I'm trying to work it into my vocabulary more often.
We just keep trying to think of how we get Gary to say aluminium.
or aluminum. So we could swap around.
He sounds wrong. He said aluminum. And we all looked at him like, Gary, what's wrong with you?
Certain words have fallen in over the years, certain haven't. I don't know what the logic is, but here we are.
All right, great.
I'm Louisa. I am a CPST. I've been a CPST since, I believe, 2008. I've been a child passenger safety technician instructor. I'm going to guess 10 years. I am a STAC, a Safe Travel for All Children instructor. That's the course specifically surrounding adaptive and assistive transportation. My other professional background is I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've worked with children and adolescents with a variety of disabilities, mental health challenges for about 20 years. I'm also a mom of 8 and grandma of 1. That's awkward admitting online. I like to pretend that I'm not that old yet. But yeah, I really like car seats. I think they're really fun. And I also really like the opportunity to talk about areas of disability. I myself am a neurodivergent adult with some pretty significant hearing loss. So I really like the opportunity to bring more attention to the needs of the disability community, to have more resources available.
Yeah, thank you so much. Honestly, I'm so thankful that I can count you guys as friends and ask you to join us in this live stream. So really, thank you so much. I think I would like to discuss share with those who maybe aren't aware a little bit more about the stack training,
Sure.
how, what's involved, and how someone might go about finding a stack training in their general area.
Yeah, so I think the stack training, so when we say stack training, that's the Safe Travel for All Children. That's a curriculum that comes out of Riley Children's in Indiana, and it really is the curriculum on the safe transportation of individuals with disabilities. It is a 2-day course that's taught all around the country. Last I knew, there was like 55-ish instructors in the US. Excited to be hearing that we're adding Gary soon as well. If you go to the Prevent Injury website, are we able to drop that in the
Yeah,
cool.
I'm going to
So
do it
people,
right now.
yay. They often have a listing of different training opportunities around the country that you can get registered for. And I think it's a great thing to do. I also would say that although there is no like recertification for this stack, because it's not a certification, it's an additional training. I think it's great to redo that every couple years if you're able, because I know that in the time that I took it a few times before I started pursuing my instructor candidacy, I also learned learned something new every single time I sat with a different instructor team or with updated curriculum. We've actually had a lot of updates to the curriculum recently, which I think are exciting. So, if you've taken it before and you have the time and access to a course, I'd consider taking it again if it's been more than 3-4 years.
There's a hybrid option available now, correct? Isn't there?
So there is,
I believe.
yeah.
I don't know if
Instructors have
anybody's teaching it.
Right. Instructors have just gotten access to it. I have not taught the hybrid version yet. I definitely like to look into it at some point in the future, but I think that's definitely an interesting idea. Yes, and that might help people, Melissa, if you're in an area where it's harder to access a training, if you're able to do some of it online, that might make it easier to commute to maybe one day or a little less time.
Yes, generally it is a 2-day in-person training. Melissa says Iowa is teaching their hybrid. That's great. You should definitely connect with the Stack Eyes there and see, get some feedback on. Day one is a lot of lecture, so
Yes.
I do see the benefit if you had students who were legit willing to put in that work on their own time. That could really, I'm interested to hear more about how the hybrid is working out. But I imagine hybrid is 1 day in person, right? Like that's probably because you still have to come in and you have to do all the actual installations. But
Melissa,
definitely.
have you taken the hybrid, or do you know anyone that has? I'd be interested to know more about that. Well, if you have, or you have any thoughts on it, put it in the chat box. I'd love to hear about it. Yeah, she's saying correct that it is that 1 day live.
Okay.
She hasn't yet. Okay.
Good to know. It's always great to add more options. We don't typically teach the hybrid CPST curriculum because, well, frankly, we don't feel like we need to. We don't really have that need, and we feel like the students do better, when they're here the whole 4 days. But for Stack, it's definitely an interesting option to explore. So if nothing else, I'm happy that it's an option that is available now. Stack training is intended to be an addendum. There was a discussion recently about whether I was always under the impression that you were required to be a CPST in order to be eligible to take the Stack training, but I don't know if there's some potential exceptions that can be made. For the most part, people who attend the Stack training have already gone through the certification course.
Yeah, because in the Stack training, we're looking at the specific adaptive assistive seats. We're not talking about seatbelt systems, and we're not talking about all those things. Those really foundational skills that I think you need coming into it.
Okay. I'd like to make some general comments about using your CPST certification to support families in your communities. STAC is helpful. If you have been STAC trained, that's a great resource, but I want to stress that I don't think it's mandatory. Not having STAC training should not be a limiting factor in your ability to support families in your community. STAC obviously gives you more foundational knowledge, and it gives you exposure to installing a variety of adaptive and assistive systems. But I'm fairly sure that I had installed some large medical seats prior to STAC training. It was just this understanding of like, this is not a normal car seat. I'm going to take half an hour to read the manual from cover to cover. And then I'm probably still going to have some questions and maybe need to follow up with somebody else to clarify, to make sure that I'm doing this right. The first time you double tether something, like if it's in a sedan, it just looks like you just question it. You're like, is this right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely staff training is helpful, but I don't want anyone to feel like they're not able to support families in their communities because they haven't had the STAC training.
Yeah, I talk about this all the time in the school setting when we're, when we're looking at children with disabilities. It's a pretty common idea that people think like, okay, there's general education and then there's special education, which is this totally different thing way over here. But just like in a school, all students are gen ed students first. Students who receive special education services are general education students who also get this support. Children with disabilities are children first. And when we take the CPST curriculum to help children in our community, we don't specify, we're going to only help, developmentally and neurotypical children. But I think sometimes we're intimidated when we don't have that knowledge or we don't have that personal experience. Just like we talk about the standard curriculum, there's a test question on that, right? Does every child with a special healthcare need an adaptive seat? And the answer is always no, conventional first. A lot of needs can be met in conventional products or with an intervention that works for a child maybe without a disability. I think just often when people don't have that life experience of working with people with disabilities, it can be intimidating. And sometimes they can lose sight that it's our typical CPST skills to start with, exactly like you talked about, taking the time to read that manual, is question number one. Assessing what works for the child works for the family. Oh, you put a child with hydrocephalus in a Revolve 360.
Wow.
I like it. I can see some reasons why that might be a great seating choice.
Agreed. Yeah. So please, yes, it can be intimidating. I mean, yeah. Louisa, sometimes I need to remind Louisa that not everybody had her upbringing.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of how I got started in disability. My parents, my father is an attorney, and he worked on the American with Disabilities Act, which is kind of considered to be the civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. And my mom wrote a curriculum on dental care for, at the time, the phrase was dental care for the handicapped, because that was the appropriate term. I'm going to guess this was in the late 60s, early 70s. Obviously, it's not a term we use now, but I grew up with many friends and family friends who utilized wheelchairs or had service dogs or, maybe had a visual impairment so I thought that was typical. And it wasn't kind of till I got to kindergarten and learned that other people had some really stigmatizing ideas about disability, that everyone didn't have the experience of, knowing people with disabilities their whole life. And it was very surprising to me. And I was a very angry kindergartner about this when other kindergartners said unkind things. And certainly Sister Anna Maria had to speak with me more than once about the appropriate way to educate my fellow kindergarten classmates.
You still remember Sister Anna Maria's name. I mean, that speaks volumes.
You do not forget those. No. Yeah. If you went to Catholic school in the 80s, it's a memorable experience.
Or any time, really. If you went to Catholic school, chances are you still Yeah. I did not go to Catholic school, but I heard from my friends who did, and I knew who all the scary sisters were. So
my partner
Fact.
went to
word
Catholic.
travels in the neighborhood.
Yeah, my partner went to Catholic school and still gets emails from Sister Immaculata asking how she is, even now. So there we are.
Yeah.
Believe it.
Okay. So yeah, while you may feel intimidated, please don't let that hold you back. However, you do need to understand when you are operating outside your area of expertise, right? Please don't be overconfident going into a situation that, just be like, oh, it's just like another no, I mean, you will probably take more time to read the manual. Many of these manuals are not very clearly written the way conventional child seat manuals are. So there's sort of a lot of squinting at, grainy diagrams and looking at the back of the page and wondering where the rest of the information is, and searching for YouTube videos. I mean, thank goodness for the YouTube video.
Oh
for
my
the
God, yeah.
lay down, because without that YouTube
I would give you the
video,
caution, though, of making sure it's the manufacturer's YouTube video,
Yeah.
not just randomly something
Correct.
anyone put on YouTube.
Yes, good point. But that's another thing too, like the normal places where you might crowdsource information might not. Just be really careful. You really want to be seeking professional resources when you are outside your area of expertise. So your friends may have a lot of experience with conventional car seats, but if they are not stack trained or don't have extensive personal training, just know that So I think this is a good point to segue into where can people get reliable professional sources of information on working with families with children with disabilities.
Yeah.
Right,
So if you are a technician who has the stack training, there are some online social media groups specifically for people with stack training, which is kind of cool because then you can see some unique situations that other people, other places in the country are encountering in some of their solutions. But that's specifically for people who already have the stack training. That's the National Center's stuff. But I would say the National Center out of Riley Children's is, I think, probably one of the number one sources of quality, evidence-based research practices. I think it gets a little bit complicated when we're looking at adaptive assistive versus kind of typical conventional for a lot of reasons. Something like there just isn't the amount of resource, there isn't the amount of data, there isn't anywhere near the amount of information there are on conventional typical seats. But Riley Children's Hospital, University of Michigan, CHOP, which is Children's Hospital out of Philadelphia. Keisha, who are we talking about on the West Coast too that does? Gary, who are we missing?
Gary, you mentioned Kendra. Where is Kendra Dornbecker?
I believe so, yes, which is Portland. Obviously, they do a lot. You will find California is a very large area, but there are some specific companies actually who kind of work with hospitals in California. And when we get into kind of later with specific things with CAST and things, we kind of explain part of that. And sometimes you get led by the system as to where you get the information. But children's hospitals generally are always a good place to start. And one of the things that I recommend is, you use the Safe Kids website, go on that search, tick the box, find a stack person you can find. And obviously you'll usually find some affiliation, some kind of state government agency or a children's hospital or something like that. So when you pair them together like that, you can be fairly sure that's where you're going to go. And the manufacturers, if you're in that moment as well, you can begin to manufacture a call. And so, Louisa's right. Like, it's not as large, it's not as wide, but once you access it, you can find that you can jump between the nodes in the network fairly quickly to get the information you want. And again, that doesn't mean it's necessarily fast, but perhaps faster than you think with the inaccessibility you first face sometimes with finding the resources. But, that tech website, the Riley website is obviously the center of it. children's hospitals with stack trained people, I'm thinking about things like, Carrie in Ohio, for example, great resource, lots of stuff there at Cincinnati Children's. Children's Hospital of Virginia is another one. They've got like 2 or 3 stack trained techs there, and all that stuff will show up on the Safe Kids website, with that search, and you tick the box to find the stack trained instructor. That's a good place.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm jumping ahead in my mind. So I'm going to reel myself back in. We're going to have some general topics of discussion. And if those of you who are watching have any specific questions or would like to lead the discussion in a certain direction, feel free to throw a comment in the comment box, and we're happy to, this is really just going to be more of a roundtable discussion. We toyed with the idea of having a presentation with slides like we did for our Side Impact live stream last month. But we've thought that there was a benefit to more of a discussion format. So yeah, feel free to lead the discussion or chime in with some thoughts of your own. Some general topics that we're going to try to touch on today will be preemies, children in casts, autism spectrum disorder. By the way, happy Autism Acceptance Month.
Yay!
Yay! Yes, I love the idea that it is Autism Acceptance Month, that we have moved past awareness and we're now focusing on supporting and embracing all of those neurodivergent people. And so I had a discussion with someone not that long ago about this was an older person, sort of like, did we think he was neurodivergent? And I looked at him and I was like, we're all neurodivergent, right? And if any of us are neurotypical, like, first of all, what is the way our brains often work is not like the classmate or the person, so I don't know, on some level, I feel like everyone involved in child passenger safety is on some level of neurodivergent. Because I feel like if you weren't, you might not be here. And I don't know.
Sometimes other neurodivergent friends of mine and I refer to neurotypical, and I love you people, but refer to neurotypicals as neurodifficults, because I don't always understand how their brains work.
Right.
And I can find it more difficult to understand the messages they're sending when they don't match up in my brain, or when there's so you neurodifficults can have your own month. This is us. Oh, I see Melissa saying she knows more neurodiverse people in car seat spaces than other spaces combined. Oh man,
right? So I have a theory. We need to explore this theory that 98% of child passenger safety technicians. Well, maybe let me. 98% of child passenger safety technicians who recertify.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting. There are a lot of people who take the class, get some exposure, like, nope, not for me. Yeah. Right. Yep. And that's why our recert rates are only hovering they're like 50, 55%, because there's a big chunk of people who nope, no thanks.
Yeah.
And they move on to something else. But for those who stick around, especially those who stick around long term, there's no doubt that
I see Jason bringing up that he might want to talk about children who need larger seating options.
Yep.
And I see Jennifer calling out. She wants to talk about behavioral needs escape artists. Yeah, I think that's definitely on our list.
For sure. Mm-hmm. Yes, we are definitely going to talk about all of those things. Voluntold may not like it. Yes. Okay. So topics. Let's talk quickly about preemies. I have, in the 20 years that I have been in this space, I have seen a huge shift in manufacturers doing a better job of designing seats for our smallest populations. Evenflo, all of their infant seats that are currently available on the market, and they have made a promise, I believe, that all of the seats going forward that they will develop are all going to start at £3. So yay for that. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine, as somebody who doesn't work in a NICU, it's really hard for me to imagine discharging a child who weighs 3 pounds, but apparently it's
happening.
It happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's been this huge shift towards releasing these kids at 3:11, so it's like if they can maintain their temperature and they can feed, they're out the door, because when you've got a NICU that's charging $40,000 a day or whatever, it was, when my kid was in the NICU, it was $20,000 a day, and that was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So, it's insane.
I think we hit $1 million each on Liam. And so I told you I have 8 children. I have 2 sets of identical twins, 10 years apart. So I did the NICU thing twice. Twice at very different times. And huge differences in what was available for my 08 twins versus my 18 twins. We call them version 1 and version 2.
As well, just to kind of add to what you were saying, Keisha, as well, like obviously we generally operate in this space where we go to a conventional seat first, as Louise was saying earlier, but there are options out there for, believe it or not, those who are less than £9 and less than £3. So, those incredibly rare scenarios, and we've seen them at Merit where it does happen.
Yeah.
There are options, but there generally tend to be last resort sort of things at that weight. But
yeah, gone are the days where you had to be 5 pounds before you could be discharged. So more. Really, everyone. I can't think of a single manufacturer at this point. Well, I can maybe think of one, but I won't throw anybody under the bus. For the most part, most infant seats, even the lower price point models, are doing a reasonable job of fitting those 4 to 5 pounders, that I think are more common in discharging. So, I think manufacturers have really done a great job of addressing small baby fit and have really made improvements to having lower harness height and maybe having a couple of different positions on the back with the splitter plate so that you can adjust the harness. I know even flow seats have the option to adjust the spacing of the width at the hip anchors. I'm not a big fan of doing that because I feel like parents won't know how to undo it. I just feel like there's an opportunity for user error when you're moving the hip strap settings like that. But nevertheless, it's an option, and it's nice to have options for when it really improves small baby fit.
Yeah, I think most people probably don't have a need to make that adjustment, but when you have that need, it's great to have that option and not be back in the Stone Age where we had to think about blanket rolls constantly and could we use a cross roll, or were we going to get our hands slapped for that? Now the manufacturers are giving us so many more options in terms of what they're shipping the products with.
Yes, agreed. And I think since we're on this topic, it's probably worth talking a little bit about angle tolerance testing. I know there can be variations between hospitals. Not everyone has the same policy on testing. I believe that Canada has gotten away from angle tolerance testing altogether. They no longer recommend it. I see Heather
Really?
nodding.
I didn't know that. I see that we have some Canadian stack people on here, but
I think obviously
I just learned something new.
We could spend a lot of time on that topic alone, but I think the gist of what we should talk about here is what happens when the baby fails the angle tolerance test. Louisa, you get these phone calls all the time, like, oh my goodness, the baby's not passing. How do you respond?
My first question is always about, well, tell me what it looked like when you set up the test. I find really well-meaning NICUs, including the ones that my own kids came out of, sometimes don't have a whole lot of education on how that test needs to be set up properly. I have funny pictures in one of my slideshows of my original version set of twins who I didn't tell them at the NICU what it is that I do. And they came in to set up the angle tolerance test and put one of my boys in something that kind of looked like those weird strollers that they had at McDonald's back 20 years ago, where it's just this like plastic seat, and they stuck my child in there at an angle that looked nothing like what his car seat would look like. And kind of, so my question number one is always, what did that angle tolerance test look like? We want to be looking at something that is apples to apples, right? So it needs to be at the same angle that the seat is going to be at in the vehicle. We talked about it being so great that a lot of the seats are coming with, soft goods that accommodate a good fit, but we want to make sure we're using the right ones. Sometimes some of those additional accessories actually can make a worse positioning, especially when we're looking at that head neck. So my first question is always wanting to know more about what that test looked like. Before we even talk about what our next options are. Most hospitals that I work with have a policy of retesting in 24 hours before they even discuss other options. Again, I agree, Keisha, it's not real universal from hospital to hospital, even in the same area. But I think whatever we're able to provide hospital personnel some training and information on how to properly set up that angle tolerance test, I think that's often like line of defense number one. And very often then when it's set up properly, they pass.
I have to ask the hand slap question. Why don't these NICUs know how to set these tests up? We've been doing these for years. So
we have, but there's not a lot of guidelines on it. It wants you to set it up and monitor for 2 hours or twice a week, but it doesn't tell you how to set it up. And it's different car seat to car seat. They want to have a single testing protocol, like you put the child in this position, you test it, but it's not universal, because it's going to depend on what that seat that particular child uses, because a child may pass in one seat and fail in another.
mm-hmm.
So I think it's a matter of, one, that there's a lot of variation, and two, I just don't know that it's something they're doing a lot of training on. I see Jennifer saying hospital dependent, no broad strokes, even in different provinces and cities, each hospital. Yeah, that's true. We see similar things here. And then I think it's not something nurses and staff are well trained on. They have a whole lot of expertise and can do some, amazing things for our tiniest kiddos, but it's just not, I have a friend who is a labor and delivery nurse, and I asked her about what her training was, because there are often people that are really seen as an expert. And she said she thought there was maybe 2 lines in a textbook on the transportation of newborns, and labor and delivery is what she does.
Yeah, tracks.
So, yeah.
It's worth probably being aware as well for some hospitals. Some don't have any sort of discharge policy, even if we're not talking about preemies. If we, just to be any child who's born, they just don't have any policy. And that actually, and again, I won't call out names, but there are people where we get a lot of phone calls kind of asking questions because the training isn't there, because the policy isn't there. And so that's when a tech might have to step in and get a phone call and say, yeah, I can come and help you out here. I understand this. I've either got the stat training, or I'm familiar with it, or I know someone who is. And, that's something that, again, if there's a kind of community event or something like that you'd want to do as part of your tech work, that would be something that's always nice to think about, where those things are lacking. It's a good way to kind of get in. And that's not just about preemies, it's about generally. So sometimes we're kind of still talking about things which probably should be there, but still aren't in a conventional way, as well as a stat way.
Then, so the next step is, okay, baby failed, let's say twice. There's a good chance.
Wait, so if it's
go ahead.
Yeah, if it's a true failure, then our next step is to look at other options. A car bed is never the first option. Whenever the child can be transported in a rear-facing seat, that's the best option. I don't know about you guys, but I've been contacted a couple times by parents who want to get a car bed so their child can nap better in the car. So I think you had an experience with someone who was really committed to the idea that for a road trip, this was a better option.
Yeah, we're not going to go there, but yes.
But the blanket statement stands that a rear-facing car seat is definitely our best option. But there's situations in which that's not possible.
Then we might be looking. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, let's talk about a situation where that may not be possible. Give an example of a situation where, even without failing the angle tolerance test, it's likely going to be that this child will be going home in a car bed. What might that look like?
Yeah, so in addition to the angle tolerance test, it may just come down to that child's body composition. If they're dealing with a medical issue that's required a surgical correction, or if they have a medical condition in which their, um, limbs may not be able to properly fit in a seat, then that's sometimes some places where we look at our beds. I know the first time I went out for an omphalocele, which is a condition where the organs actually are external to the body. I had never seen that in real life before the first carcinoma, whatever. And it was just a situation that you look at this child and all of a sudden there's the realization of, oh, right, where do we put the straps? Where do we put the buckles? So sometimes we're lucky. And I know Gary never wants to be a Merit salesman when we talk about adaptive, but Merit's given us a lot of options. Michaela, I see you saying that they sell the Dream Ride on Amazon and Walmart, and it's great that it's price point accessible, and it's great that that's quick, because that can be a challenge with some of the adaptive seats if you're working with a hospital that doesn't have a loaner program. Some of the other seats you can't buy at a conventional place. You can't get them tomorrow. So for that reason, I'm glad that some of the retailers have Dream Ride, but I also have that same concern about people using it maybe when there's not the medical necessity.
And some of that as well. I mean, some of the Dream Ride itself actually is a design that dates back to the 80s in terms of its shell. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of been around. It's been through a lot of ownership and manufacturer. We're also seeing other things as well in the industry combined where, particularly under R129 regulations, car beds are much more common. Things like the RNA Matrix Lite, the Matrix 2, they've kind of, certainly become a sort of a normalized thing. And that kind of doesn't necessarily help when you've got things like the internet and you're going to read that. And as I say, I go back to what Louise said, and I just kind of, I'll be an echo here, rear facing is always the better way to go here. And that's something that as CPSTs, obviously, we know not to recommend that. But as you're saying, Keisha, there are those sort of scenarios like that. And car beds range from anything like that you can buy online all the way up to something like a Hope. But in the middle of that, maybe if you want to kind of look at it that way, there's things like the Jefferson, which was thinking about the omphalocele condition is specifically designed, and that's a rear-facing seat. But it's not solely designed for that, right? There can be other situations where that can work. Different surgeries, for example, or another example where someone maybe can't go in, rear-facing in a standard. So you have to look at a car bed. But the Jefferson might work in that scenario too. And we had that quite recently at CHOP, where I was down there kind of, I talked to someone there and they ended up with the Jefferson. So they didn't even go to a car bed at that stage. So there are those in-between things to kind of aim at as well. But it's very important, as you say, to be aware of that kind of larger, there's car beds out there that you could just buy kind of.
Don't do it.
Hold on. We need to know why, and there are other options as well.
I see Renee calling out that they use car beds for their post-op myelomeningocele babies. So she's referring to babies that have had a spina bifida repair, which might look like there's an opening and a surgical incision on their back. So I'm guessing, Renee, that you're talking about utilizing a car bed to position them prone or side lying. She also calls out having used the Jefferson recently. So there's definitely a lot of options.
Options exist.
Yeah.
So as a CPST, excuse me, I mean, you should be aware of the products that are on the market. It's really probably not our place to recommend certain products. If a parent reaches out to you, it's always best to be part of a team approach. And depending on the situation, the ideal is always that you are one piece in the team that is assessing the child's needs and how to support those needs.
I mean, that's what we bring to the table, is the expertise in, transportation safety and utilizing the car seat properly and installing the car seat properly. But that's definitely the area that we need to lean on the medical personnel to make the recommendation as far as what's safe there for that particular child. I mean, I'm not a pediatrician. I am not a nurse. I can't make that determination about, is it safe for you to ride prone on your belly, side lying, or supine on their back. But that's the beauty of having a team, is that we can speak to those medical personnel, get their recommendations for what's going to be safe and healthy for that baby, and then talk about the options for how we can help them accomplish that in their vehicle.
1,000%. All right, let's talk a little bit about casts. Now, casts, I mean, that's a really wide topic. If anyone has any particular cast questions, you can throw them in the comments. I think perhaps the most challenging and frequent catastrophe, I just made that up on the spot. I'm so proud of myself. Bad pun.
That was like a dad joke. Yeah.
It was. Just literally popped into my neurodivergent mind, and there it was. It's the spica cast, ye old spica cast. So many different variations. No two look the same. Just when you think you've seen it all, something else comes along, and you're like, oh my, that's. So yeah, spica casts. I was a new technician, probably back in the early 2000s when I had my first spica cast experience, and it was a newborn. And I remember driving to this woman's house with a whole bunch of my personal car seats just to see if the baby would, fit in anything. And it was a real eye opener for me because, man, I mean, for anybody who's ever had to care for a child who is not potty trained in a spica cast, like, my heart really goes out to you, because
or who is potty trained, still just the physical limitation of the cast makes it very difficult.
That was an experience that has really stayed with me, and I will always remember that woman and that situation. But spica casts can pose really huge challenges, because oftentimes, it's sad, but oftentimes there's no consideration for the fact that the child is not going to fit in their car seat after you cast them.
I think that was one of my favorite things in the STAC curriculum, where it tells you, well, consult with the surgeon about what would be a good angle for the car seat. I have yet to meet a surgeon anywhere that would like my opinion on the angle at which they should cast their patient. And to be fair, appropriately so, right? But yeah, you're absolutely right.
They seem to give almost no consideration to it. And then suddenly the parent, the child, or the caregiver is left with this casted child. And now what? I remember getting a frantic phone call from some woman who was at Babies R Us, RIP Babies R Us. And somebody who worked at the store had my contact information, and she called me and she said, I drove here, with my kid on a pillow because she doesn't fit in her car seat anymore, and I don't know what to do. And I remember her saying, like, I drove like 20 miles an hour from the orthopedics office to Babies R Us, and just flipping out because no consideration was given to how is this child going to be safely transported. So sometimes you can get a conventional seat to work.
Yeah.
But good luck, because it's like trial and error.
Keitha, was it this past summer that we had a child that came into a typical check event?
Yeah, it was
What
last
might be the background on that? And
Yep.
and how were they being this was a child that had it wasn't a planned spica casting. I think the child had an accident
Yes.
and left
Broke his
the
mirror.
emergency room.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the spica cast. And how did they, we won't call out who sent them out, but how were they sent out? Was it on pillows on a reclined vehicle seat?
I think they were given the old good luck.
Yeah.
I don't think that they were given any guidance. I don't think they were told pillows. It was a late discharge. I remember that detail. This kid was not discharged at, 11 a.m. It was more like 11 p.m. And they finally got the discharge paperwork done. And mom was like, but how do I? And the discharge nurse was like, I don't know. Figure it out.
Yeah.
And
I've had parents contact me because their orthopedist told them to, lay the kid down in the back seat, or to, recline the seat and make them comfortable, or to put the seats down in their station wagon and let the child lie in the back. And I've got those calls in the last 2 years. And I live in a, right, I don't live in the middle of nowhere. I live in a populated area.
Yeah. So let's talk about some options for spica casts. Sometimes you're lucky enough. Julie, I see, left a comment here that she was working at BRU and had a family come in, and they were able to find something that worked. But it does take trial and error. And, there have been times when I've asked for pictures of the casted child, and then I look around at what I've got in my training inventory, and I'll load 6, 7, 8 seats into the back of my vehicle, drive to this person's house, and then just hope that something works. And most of the time I've been successful, but there have been a few times where the splay was so wide that nothing other than a Wallenberg would likely have worked. Right? Or maybe there was a seat that would have worked, but it wasn't something that I had available to me. So you can only work with what you've got. But yeah, I mean, thank goodness for the Wallenberg.
Yeah.
It was a product that I found intimidating. And I was not even a new tech, but I remember telling Bill, one of our local instructors, like, yeah, nope, not learning that, like, all yours, like, that's scary looking. And now that I've gotten to know Wally really well, like, Wally's pretty straightforward. And it's actually Jack's favorite car seat. He's sitting here smiling, laughing, nodding his head. Jack loves the Wallenberg. Like, he really appreciates its simplicity in design and how versatile it is. So don't be afraid of Wally. Gary, can you talk a little bit maybe about Wallenberg and if there's anything new on that front?
Of course. No, absolutely. I think first thing to say is for anyone out there kind of who's listening who is not familiar with the Wallenberg itself, it's a seat known in the CPST community now as the Wally by a lot of people. It's a very unusual seat in its design because obviously it has to be open-sided. And it's a seat that mostly is bought by hospitals and is a convertible seat. So it's rear-facing, forward-facing. And it goes, and one thing's really important here to kind of bring in, it's kind of 5 to 80 pounds, but we're talking when we do spica casts or any casts, if you know the weight of your kid, you may not know the weight of your casted child. So whatever you do, getting the weight, any discharge, that's important. Sometimes it can get missed, but it can add significant amount of weight, and that can make a huge difference. The Wallenberg does have latch, predominantly is installed with seatbelt because the latch window is quite low in terms of the weighting and the poundage. But it's a wide seat. It's 17 inches wide, but technically it runs to about 19 inches wide with the cover. And one of the things you have to be aware of when you're kind of working with it is there are kind of 3 particularly unusual things about it. One is that it has a sled that converts it to rear facing and it detaches completely from the seat. I'm actually working on Wallenberg 2, which will not have that feature. It will have something different to serve the same purpose. I'm doing a side impact one at the moment, so we're focused on that. So it's and then obviously it has a positioning wedge and a hammock and also a riser to use rear facing, and they're all fundamentally just blocks of foam that you put in place to get the right fit. So it takes some configuring, and as Keisha said, it's very intimidating seat to look at. This kind of metal bars is the way it's designed, is kind of very unconventional. The belt paths are very unconventional, particularly the rear-facing belt path, which is actually 2 webbing loops. And obviously, you go on meritcarseat.com, you can obviously kind of have a look, see the photos, look through the manual if you wish to. But it is the most common seat now. We did have a few seats. We had the kind of the Quokka or the Quokka, as some people say, depending. That's been discontinued. I think the last ones of those are expiring around the middle of this year, I believe. Most of them already have. We're continuing with the Wallenberg. We see the need. We obviously will carry on doing that. But the Wallenberg can work up to kind of 80 pounds, and again, that's casted weight. Just to be clear. One of the things with it is the installation could affect other things. It's a wide seat. Keisha, you've mentioned how wide some spica casts can be. Some have a rigidizing bar. We also get shoulder spica cast where you get the shoulder that's casted. And that can mean sometimes when you get in the vehicle, if it's the family car, you might have to uninstall a seat. If you're in a 3 across scenario, you're going to have to change that. So you just got to be aware of that. The good thing with this sort of stuff is that when it does happen, if you're at a hospital and it's a scheduled operation, it's a scheduled surgery, a lot of hospitals do have a supply of Wallenbergs and people trained in using them. Just to kind of use CHOP's example, they have a system where when they know, they will actually bring the Wallenberg to the bed before discharge, run through it with the family and whoever's there, understand, using the kind of diagrams at the side as a very basic overview. Then they'll disappear and wait for the family to bring the vehicle up. That way, when the family gets there, it's not this big intimidating thing. So one of the things you can do as a tech to make yourself more familiar with is kind of, hopefully you can kind of work with that, maybe kind of get those sorts of things in place to kind of help with those sorts of things. But as I say, Merit's always at the end of the phone. Please call us anytime. We don't have a phone system. We just aren't. Shane or I will answer, and we'll happily answer the questions. But it's an unusual seat, but it serves a purpose. Just be aware that it does weigh about 40 pounds when you pick it up with the sled on. So be careful of your back. But there's a reason for that, to give it its strength and its safety. So hopefully that's a nice overview, and happy to obviously jump in with any questions. Please ask, and I'll do what I can. We also have the Hope as well. That can be worked for a cast as well. It's not just and that's obviously the Hope car bed. And there's a specific version of the Hope car bed for spiker car, where both can work, depending. And that comes back to your case, Keisha, where it's like, what do you do if you can't use a conventional seat? The Wallenberg and the Hope are there as well. And there's obviously other options as well. Not to be a Merit salesman here, but Louisa was mentioning earlier, kind of, just lie on the back seat. There are options such as the Lie Flat Easy On, which can work, and that is an approved FMVSS. It's generally not used so much with these scenarios, because it is limited by the width of the vehicle and that sort of thing. And obviously, if there's any other kids that need to be in the car,
it's also not the most comfortable thing on the planet.
No, exactly. And I think, Louise, I think you probably have the only photo of it being used correctly anywhere as well. And it can be very tricky to use correctly. And again, that's one of those things that's kind of been around for a long time, and other options have appeared since. But in a pinch and in a certain thing, it can be the right thing. And the most important thing is always picking, going back to what Louise was saying earlier, even though this is a stack-centered kind of discussion, we're still using the same skill set. So we come back to that.
Yeah.
It's going to fit the vehicle, it's going to fit the child, and it's going to be used correctly all the time. That applies here, right? And if that's the thing that works, then great, that's the thing that works.
We've got some other options too, like the Wallaroo with the Spica kit, or the Spirit Spica. It really just depends on that angle of the casting. That's why I think it's so difficult to predict, because Keisha's absolutely right. Every cast looks so different. I see Renee's asking about the DF2 brace instead of a Spica cast for a femur. I have not worked with the DF2. Gary, I don't know if you have. I've seen the DF2. My thought would be, I need to know a lot more about the hinge joints at the hip and knee, wondering how much flexion there is with that, or if it's set at a specific set angle. If you don't know what the DF2, it looks almost like a series of AFOs that are connected by hinges, and then also wraps around the hip. So it kind of immobilizes in a different way than the cast. I know someone earlier was asking about a Pavlik, which is a different system, but sometimes you have to think of the same considerations as you would the Spica cast. But with the DF2, Renee, to answer your question, I would want some more information about how much movement is in those hinges. Renee's calling out that the orthopedist that she was working with thought it would eliminate the need for specialized transportation. But Renee does note that the child did still need a Spica seat. I would expect that as well. I suppose with a small child who has a particularly wide conventional car seat, maybe it's possible if the angle's right. But maybe it's possible sometimes with the Spica too, if the angles match up. I mean, often it's that kind of hip angle where you can't change, right? Because our children, you may flex those hips to get them in the seat. With a Spica or a DF2 or a Pavlik, you might not have that option. And then there's display, kind of how wide the legs are spread is really going to dictate, do they physically fit in the seat? But if those things all lined up in the right way, it may be possible. But I would certainly have a whole lot of questions and want to see what that fit looks like. I would expect, like you experienced, that a Spica seat very likely would still be necessary.
Just to kind of jump in, if I may, with resources, something that we're seeing a lot of in terms of supplying seats and kind of where they're going as they go out the door. There seems to be at the moment a kind of movement among hospitals who are doing scheduled surgeries that involve casting of various types to be centralized around one hospital medical system or hospital in a state. It's particularly true in places like Ohio and Maryland. So in terms of kind of, I don't know how long that will last or what the situation is, but often we're seeing people get sent to a certain place to have a surgery done. So you do get a concentration of specialisms. So if you're looking for those resources, finding that one particular place, is sometimes the kind of gold dust that you're looking for to get information. Again, that's certainly not nationwide, but we're definitely seeing a pattern that way where a lot of stuff is being concentrated in certain places because that's where the specialism is in the state for them.
Right.
So it's one of those things. Obviously, thinking about people like Carissa and Jackie, who obviously do a lot of work up in Vermont, they'll go down to MGH, or they'll go to Mass General for a specific thing. In Ohio, you generally, kind of towards Toledo way now, we're seeing an awful lot of questions and things coming out of there, where it's really kind of a production line almost of this sort of thing. So just being aware of how those things work can help with the tech work as well, because once you get into one of those, you can find everything you need to know.
That makes sense that you're going to see more spicacasts where the orthopedists who specialize, in treating those hip issues. So, yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Here in our area, we're seeing the majority of them at the larger trauma center hospitals, but still sometimes get a random one at some rural small place, and they have no idea what to do with it. So it seems to be the case. Keisha, I know down by you, do we have a colleague who was successful in being able to work with the surgical team in their health system, just providing them information so they had that awareness? That I haven't followed up with her to see, how the impact of that. I don't know if you know.
I don't. It's a great question. So yeah, there's a healthcare system on Long Island, and they had this crazy idea that they would have like a lunch and learn with their ortho team and bring in some casted dolls and some of the car seats that they had in their program and show the orthos like this is the problem. You do all these lovely things, but then they don't fit. And they were very, trying to pick a good adjective. They were nervous going into this because we didn't expect it to be well received. And they were surprised that, I guess, orthos, maybe just surgeons in general, have a bit of a reputation for, and I understand, like nobody wants to be, when you're the surgeon, you don't want to be told how to do your job. I get that. But, they were very careful in how they approached it, and was just simply an awareness thing. And they got a really great response. They got a lot of, wow, we had no idea sort of responses at the end. But it'll be interesting to follow up to see if there has been any impact in how kids are casted. Because all they were trying to say is like, whenever possible, if you could just keep this in the back of your mind. And it went well. So I want to encourage them to maybe come up with a presentation for Kids in Motion. I think the window for throwing in an abstract might be closed for Kim this year, but I'll look into that, because if they've had success with getting some changes from the surgeons, that I think would be a really worthy presentation for Kids in Motion conference.
Yeah. No, and sometimes it may come down to you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Many surgeons are brilliant people who know many, many things and probably just never considered. And then how do you stuff this in the car?
Yeah. Right. And then the whole issue too about rear facing, forward facing, right? Like if it's a newborn, well, then it has to be rear facing or car bed. But then when you have those, kids who are over 12 months, but not 2 yet, there's like, you want to put them rear facing, but the legs just don't fit. Right. And then you're left with, okay, well, And I do know that if you are in a state with a rear-facing till 2 law, that at least one, I know Even Flow will be willing to provide you with a medical exemption letter. So I don't know that anybody has ever been ticketed for having a child in a spica cast be forward facing before age 2. I feel like that would have to be a law enforcement officer having a really, really, really bad day to write that ticket. But I think it's a concern for parents who perhaps know the law is rear facing till 2, but sometimes it's just not possible, and better to have a properly restrained, albeit forward facing, 1-year-old than having the kid propped up on pillows.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's just one of the many gray areas in transporting children with disabilities, because unlike the regular CPST curriculum where, there's a lot of black and white in STAC, there's a lot of gray areas, and there's a lot of, okay, maybe it's not the best, but can it be good? Can it be better? Even if best practice is not achievable at the moment, what else can we do? Again, when you realize that the kid is being transported on somebody's lap in the back seat, then anything that you can do to improve upon that is in the right direction.
Right. And our goal as CPSTs is for the child to leave safer than they've arrived. Obviously, we're always striving for that gold standard, but you're absolutely right. I mean, when you get into the world of disability, it is shades of gray, because it's not, the world was not designed, the products were not designed around that particular unique child. It'd be super cool if we could, scan a child into some kind of AI generator and print a car seat that fits them. Gary, get on this. I think
Gary, I was just going to say,
I'm working on it. Yeah, it's a great idea. I'm there.
If I know anybody who could actually make this happen, it's you.
Gary, it'll be a kiosk that will be available in the lobby of every major shopping center, right? And then you just scan your kid.
Yeah, I don't want to get caught on casts for too long, obviously, neither. But we are working on 3D scanning casts. We're actually kind of working on something where I'm obtaining casts from different hospitals. We're making 3D models of them, and we're using that for what will be the new Wallenberg in due course. So we are trying to kind of bring in all the different types of casts and create some sort of average cast in some way with a 3D model that I can then use to do that. So hopefully that will come in future for all you out there. So.
Awesome. I should have known that you were probably already all over that.
Of course, Gary is scanning casts. Of course he is. Yeah. Yes, I love that.
I see Michaela calling out. I'm gonna quote you, Michaela, because there's no other way to say this well. Disabled life often means accepting good enough, because you may not ever be able to make it to that good, that great, that best. Yeah, it's often a lot of compromise on how do we get the most function that we can, the most comfort that we can. And yeah, it's not always perfect, but that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, and it doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that it's not a place to focus our energy in supporting, people have access to the best quality transportation they're able to.
That can be a stretch, though, for some CPS technicians who, who like to operate in this very black and white world, who have trouble with these thinking outside of the box, critical thinking skills, but what does the manufacturer say? I mean, I'll never forget the first time I had to put a child in a spica cast in a conventional seat. I won't mention the manufacturer. And again, this was 20 years ago, but I called them and I was like, listen, here's the situation. I had to use some roll towels underneath to fill that gap, and they were like, I was hoping that they would be like, okay, yeah, we understand. And they were like, no. And I was like, okay, but I did it anyway. So, but I was looking for that. I wanted someone to tell me, I wanted the manufacturer to tell me that they were okay with my creativity, and they were not. And I don't know what I was expecting, but yeah, sometimes when you're used to, well, what does the manual say? What are the recommendations? What is best practice? And then we start moving into all this gray area. It can be disconcerting, I think, for some techs who really like the black and white.
I will say, there's obviously still shades of gray everywhere, but that is one thing I do like about working with some of the manufacturers that are more knowledgeable in the area of disability. There are conventional manufacturers, Keisha. I don't know whether or not you want to call out by name, but there are conventional manufacturers who have people on their team with a lot of adaptive assistive knowledge that sometimes are able to, on a really specific case by case basis, not a blanket statement, but are willing to work with families and technicians on finding a solution that'll work for their child.
Yeah, and honestly, I think Evenflow deserves a shout out because of all the conventional manufacturers. Evenflow is, Michaela. Yeah, we don't even have to cough. We can just say, like, way to go, Evenflow. Thank you for being a role model in this, and that we hope some of the other car seat manufacturers are taking notice. And a lot of it has to do with Sarah Haverstick being an amazing human being and also a stock instructor. So, she's really pushing it from her seat at the table.
I'm meeting with Sarah on Monday, so I will let her know in our Zoom meeting that they were called out and it was great. So I'll let her know.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate the work.
Look, hopefully she's going to raise the bar for other manufacturers. Mm-hmm. Other manufacturers, get yourself a stack trained person that can help navigate those things. It'd be awesome.
Yes,
I'd love for every manufacturer to have one. That'd be super cool.
Gary, can you talk a little bit about how specialized restraints, what standards they need to comply? How does it differ from conventional seats and FMVSS 213?
Yeah, of course. I mean, very simply, they all have to pass the same standards. Now, that's on a very basic level. And many of you who are listening here may be familiar with the fact that crash test dummies, as biofidelity goes, we've come a long way, but they're not quite there. And they do sit in seats in slightly strange ways. And there have been tests where they have been legitimate tests, where even just for an ATD and a booster has a 40 millimeter cushion put behind them because it's too rigid to actually sit in the seat properly. So there are these sort of areas where these sort of things happen. The difference mainly is when you're designing for something, you're coming at it from a different perspective. So, for example, if we think about something like the Roosevelt, 115 pounds is a slightly odd limit. We tend to think of 65, or now most recently because of 213A, we think of 30 pounds rather than 35 for infant only seats, this sort of thing. But broadly speaking, the dummies that you choose to test with are what is going to set your levels, basically, in terms of kind of height and weight. So when we did the Roosevelt, that was effectively tested to all FMVS 213 standards at the time. We're obviously working on that, getting through the 213A testing right now. We're going back very shortly. That's all looking quite positive in terms of things we've had to adjust. And that's where you start. Where you then go from the kind of basic standards is what do we test with? So most will start to look at things like the hybrid 5th percentile female is the kind of one of the dummies. And again, that's not really necessarily part of something that you do with a 65-pound limit seat, but it is going to get you certain places. And what you have to consider with that is that when your parameters for what you're aiming at as a designer change with the dummy that you're using, but you have to imagine it differently. So with the Wallenberg, we know that when we put the dummy in the seat and we test it, it's actually going to be about 1.5 to 2 inches higher in reality, because they're going to have a cast. So kind of how do we then approach the standard from a perspective of, we know this has to pass it, but we also know that there's another standard that we like to hold higher, right? To say, well, actually the dimensioning of this particular piece has to be this because we know that the geometry will be A, B, or C, accordingly. So when you're kind of looking at it, it's not that the standards change. You have to pass all those same standards. Right. What dummies you select and how the seat's going to be used is what you really have to think about. And right at the end of that is things like usability, like simplicity of adjustment. And sometimes you have to make compromises. It would be great if the Roosevelt had a no rethread harness, but you'll never get the upper strength in the shell to make that work if you don't. So you can't have it. So we tend to look at these things from a more kind of slightly grayer area after you've gone to the very standard and the minimum testing. So things, for example, when we come up with, we work with obviously people to do kind of custom solutions with various things. But if you're testing with a Crabby, excursion isn't going to be an issue. You're never really ever going to get near failing the excursion because the dummy is very small. As soon as you're up to kind of, the 6-year-old, think about the kind of 10-year-old, going back to the days of kind of highway harness seats and those sorts of things when we had kind of 80 pounds and passing kind of 10-year-olds, then excursion becomes more of an issue. So you have to think about, excursion that way. There's been an awful lot of amazing research recently. People like Gretchen Baker at Ohio State and Julie Mansfield, thinking about the positioning of dummies in seats and what we call HBMs or human body models, which are effectively the data that goes into creating simulation software. And then we have the ATD as the ultimate incarnation of HBMs. And that's changing a lot quite quickly. And so we may see different things that are kind of coming up where people model things differently. And certainly when we do simulations and when we model things, we tend to have to think about, here's the basic standard. We know we have to pass it, but there's a standard that we are impressing upon ourselves. And I'm not speaking solely of merit here. I know other people do this too, where we say, well, that isn't good enough. There has to be something that's kind of slightly better for that, because we know that there's going to be, you might get asymmetry in muscle tone. So someone's particularly leaning to one side. Well, as we were talking about in the last kind of live stream, you could technically, if you really wanted to, just put a side impact structure on one side of a seat and it would technically pass. But it relies on the fact, and the spirit of the regulations and the testing relies on the fact the manufacturers are not going to do that. And we've got amazing people like Sarah Haverstick, as you say, who are kind of pushing beyond standards itself. So broadly speaking, the basic level is they go through every other test that everything does. The dummy decides, where you can set your weight limits for that with what you pick for larger medical seats. But there's also a standard that you have to say is beyond what is basic. And so that's what you generally tend to design to. And we tend to have conversations and rely on a lot of people like Julie and Gretchen and all these great people who kind of do these work to understand, well, maybe this isn't the case. And we're certainly seeing a lot of influence at the moment that's going to kind of definitely fall in. And we're thinking about the sunset setting of type 1 requirements for that sort of thing, where, we're effectively seeing kind of what do vehicle systems themselves have on child restraints. So, for example, what we call ABES, kind of automatic braking events. There's something called late maneuvers in research crash testing, which is low acceleration, time extended maneuvers, which is basically someone saying, oh, I'm going into an accident. What do I need to do? Brake, turn. And there's a thought process. And there's a lot of research at the moment about the positioning of things to do with booster seats versus harness seats, this sort of stuff. There's no definitive answers yet, but all that spirit of that research then folds into the general environment. And then you then take that into your designs to say, well, this is better. I would feel very, very uncomfortable putting a seat out there in a frontal test that has a HIC of 998. Technically, fine.
Right.
But that's what we like about you.
Yeah.
You don't want to do that, right? So you want to set your limits and how you design. And I'll be quiet now because I could talk about this for ages. But it's one of those things where it's kind of, there's a basic standard. That's your 213. That's what you have to pass. No questions. But beyond that, there is a spirit of regulations that we take upon ourselves as CPSTs, as designers, as people interested in safety, in public health, to say, we can do better. And if we do better, we can demonstrate that is better through testing, through design, and then that can inform the spirit of the regulations. Because, as wonderful as many people are in NHTSA who try hard, NHTSA generally tend to move slowly with these things. We speak about Evenflow earlier. Evenflow had one of the first side impact initiatives within themselves in the late 90s, when NHTSA had only started the conversation about potential side impact testing around 1995. So manufacturers were ahead of where the regulations were in that regard. So we're always trying to do that. So we're always trying to design to the standards that we kind of set ourselves and kind of push forward. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that hopefully is a good overview.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Gary. You're always...
Sometimes Gary makes me feel dumb because he is so incredibly knowledgeable.
I know, but my joke is always that if I'm the dumbest person in the room, then I'm the happiest person in the room because I have the most to learn. And so I just always try to surround myself with people who are smarter than I am and hope that some of it, I absorb via osmosis or something.
Well, it's absolutely mutual here. Please, I learn everything from Louisa, Keisha, yourself, Heather. It's wonderful to do. So I'm very lucky myself.
Thank you. And just as a
I
reminder,
also love to know that the manufacturers are putting that kind of thought and that spirit of, okay, I don't want to put this on the market because I didn't fail by 0.01 millimeter or whatever. I love that your objective is how can I really take it beyond the bare minimum.
And so Gary, just to clarify, some of the limits, the harness limits especially, are basically based on the limit of the dummy that you're able to test with.
Correct. Yeah, largely that is how it works. Now, you can make inferences, in various ways, but the idea is, when you go into a test, it obviously, you have to be able to do certain things, and again, there are grey areas in this. Obviously, there is a bracket for things like belt tension, and sometimes you can get to awkward things like when you test with latch. Can you get the same tension with the latch as you can when you test with the actual belt? Because obviously, once you test, the webbing is cut away and dispensed with, and then it's reinstalled in the equipment next time round. But there's a kind of bracket, so sometimes there's kind of differences in there, but the dummies dictate really what you can do, and it's your job to say, well, we can put the harness slots on the seat here, we can have this harness height, we can have this width, we can have this level of recline, but everything with testing is really about what you trade and what you got, and you're always looking at your 3 axes. The standard, there's a long stand, the SAE J211 standard, which isn't anything to do with crash testing per se, but it's the way everything orientates itself for testing, and it relates to vehicle crash testing through to child restraint testing, and it's the orientation system of the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis, and that effectively then is you will get readings on each axis when you test. So like the frontal axis, the excursion is going to be obviously with the head, but you don't expect too much kind of sideways. But you can actually gain with better protection by trading some of those axes. So if you can, in a side impact, if you can make the head roll and move forwards, you'll generally get something better. But the other thing you're playing with at the same time is slightly odd characteristics. So for example, something like HIC, and again, I don't want to get too far off topic of disabilities here, but HIC is a unitless value, and it's because it's something that we call scalable. It goes against a system where it's meant to represent a severity of injury. So it's bracketed. And so obviously, above 1,000 is serious brain injury, right? 2 is you wouldn't even notice it, right? So it's and we kind of aim for that. So a lot of it is kind of unitless, and that's what you figure in when you're kind of thinking about these things, and where do we put the harness height? Like, where do we put those harness slots? How far apart are they? Going back to the things like preemies, do we put a lower set of harness slots in? Does that then compromise the structural integrity of the seat when we test? So you have to bring all those things in, but the dummies are the core starting point of where you are to define what you can say later. So we know, for example, there are tests that you can go to 35 pounds, but the spirit of the rules has changed, and now we've pressed it down to 30. So that's not really defined by the dummy anymore, but that's what we're saying because we know that that's the better thing to do because of the history that we have. So the dummy's the starting point, but ultimately you end up with that. And that's why normally you end up with the kind of 65 pounds. And the dummies have various instrumentation, and there's margins of, things that you're allowed to kind of have, because nothing's ever going to be perfect. But the dummies are always what dictate those final numbers. That's the core. But you can work around it to figure out what you then say on certain things. Some of it can be a safety margin too. That, moving from 35 pounds to 30 pounds is one of those things where we know that's the better thing to do broadly. So that's what we're going to do, but that's not about the dummy. So they can be set by other things, but usually the dummy's where you start, and what you trade and what you design is how you select exactly what you're going to aim at. And for disabilities, that's a very different puzzle. Hence why we use the hybrid fifth female for the Roosevelt to get to that 115 pounds, and that's exactly where that figure comes from.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, I really want to steer the conversation. I know everyone has questions. I've seen the questions in the chat, and I know just in general that everyone has questions about what to do with these large for their age, immature kiddos. Melissa's most recent comment is, wondering if an adaptive manufacturer could be the solution for filling a gap, right? We are desperately missing conventional seats that go to 80 pounds. And some of them even went past 80. And granted, back in those days, pretty much anyone could rate anything to 80 or 90 pounds. So I'm not sure if people are aware of why we lost those products. So I'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Just for some historical context. We used to have seats that went to 80 and even 90 pounds with the 5-point harness. And then NHTSA decided, okay, if you're going to do this, if you're going to rate above 65 pounds, you need to test and pass with the 10-year-old ATD. And the 10-year-old dummy it's a beast. Like, this is a big dummy for a conventional harness seat. And not only do you have to test and pass with this ATD, but you have to test with type 1 belt, which is lap belt only, and no tether. And you have to pass with this gigantic dummy that's installed in a harness seat with only a lap belt and no tethering. And guess what? It really wasn't. It was beyond the limits of what was possible, at least at the time, for most of the conventional seats. So that's why we lost our 80-pound seats, and they were replaced with the same or similar version of seats that were only 65 pounds. And we've been there ever since. But we, there's not a day that goes by that we don't see some desperate parent saying, my child is not ready for a booster, or my child is a persistent unbuckler. And I know those are two things that often overlap, so I'm going to try to separate them. Let's focus the conversation a little bit about if you have a child who's not necessarily an escape artist, but is, a 70-pound 3-year-old who has displayed an inability to stay buckled in a booster seat, even if it's not like an escape artist type of situation, most 3-year-olds just are too wiggly, right?
Yeah, I mean, sitting in a booster is not really a developmentally appropriate expectation for a 3-year-old.
No.
And I think Jason may have called out earlier that, what's out there for those 65-pound plus 2-year-olds. And we've all
they're
seen
out
them,
there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see
absolutely
more, younger children whose body size, shape, and composition just may not fit some of those conventional seats. And sometimes even if the weight limit is within the limit, I've definitely had more than a handful of kiddos who either just hip width or shoulder width, even though they may be within the harness limit, just don't physically fit comfortably in that seat. And I definitely do. Yeah, that's what you end up with, is that, yeah. I do miss those 80-pound seats that were, available at one time. I think it's tough because that's what I was thinking of.
What were you thinking? The Husky?
The Husky.
Yeah, I can pull one down.
I was thinking Traveler Plus, but same.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the Traveler Plus was the original seat, and then it was, I think, the first incarnation was the
Super Elite. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was the Husky, and then eventually the Regent. And that blow molded shell is, those things are going to last forever. At some point,
I fit in that seat.
Yeah, I probably do too, and that's saying something. But yeah, we're all struggling with the same thing, and I don't know.
It's tough because some of those adaptive seats could do a really great job, but the price points, although I know, manufacturers do their best to keep things as accessible as possible, just because it's a much smaller market that there's, and Gary obviously knows more about this than I do, but a lot of them are not at super accessible price points, and families with these larger children very often can't go buy, a $700-800 seat that fits their child properly. And I've kind of gotten mixed feedback on people's ability to get an adaptive seat covered with medical coding, of just the child's BMI. Sometimes when it's in conjunction with another disability or a specific syndrome that may cause the child to have that higher BMI, then I've seen it get through. But I don't know that I've ever personally seen one get through just on that. I don't know if anyone else in the chat's had a different experience. But then sometimes the next question is, okay, well then, do we just put them in a travel vest? Because you can buy it on Amazon and you can buy it in the same-ish price range as a conventional seat. And I certainly think there's a place for those products. And I've owned some and used some myself. In fact, I have a run on car crashes recently. I did have one many years ago where two of my kiddos were in ride safers, but it's not necessarily the universal solution that I think sometimes we wish it could be.
And I think this as well is one of those kind of areas where we need to kind of think about kind of good, right? Good is something here, and maybe that's the place to aim. So we want to go to that kind of like better idea. But as you were saying earlier, Keisha, that there is a judgment call we have to make, and something we can rely on as CPSTs is, even if we're not stat trained, we do this sort of thing not infrequently. The obvious example would be something like a pool noodle, right? Where we make a call that fits, and that's something that's kind of quite standard for us. But that's in itself a kind of gray area in certain ways. And so we kind of think, well, do we make a judgment call now, right? And, as Louisa, as you were saying, just keep in mind, safer than when you came in. Now, that might not mean that you can get to where you want to get to. And you might find other barriers in the way. We've certainly had cases where, we've been somewhere. We had an instance at Riley once where, the parent was effectively somewhat questioning the diagnosis that they had. So they didn't want something. So we weren't in a situation where it was kind of, well, hang on a second, how do we make sure that this kid is in the safest seat? It's more that the parent felt, for whatever reason that they did, and it's no feelings are ever illegitimate in any way, but we were kind of thinking that they were saying their doctor was saying a certain thing, and I know that some of the doctors at Riley were thinking probably not what they said, and they kind of said, well, yeah, we'll get that information, and they basically never heard from them again, because that they felt in some way that there was either some sort of stigma, some sort of like problem, they'd failed in some way. So sometimes we face other barriers that are kind of strange to making these things work, and it's something to sort of be prepared for. It's very rare, but we have heard of it from time to time throughout the year, where there is something where it's kind of, there's a fear in the parent, and there's something like, what does this mean in the long term? And you can get a freeze on communication between doctors and OTs and parents and CPSTs, and sometimes you have to kind of work your way in and find that sense of empowerment, and again, to keep things going. But it can be tricky, and this is one of those cases where this, the kind of heavier child in this instance, is where that sometimes happens, sadly.
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk solutions. What's worked for you guys with these just larger body size children? Because we could go on, I know we could talk all day about the numerous challenges, but what's been working well for you? Keisha, I know you've had quite a few.
Yeah, and usually at least a short-term solution is a booster seat. And, just some education with the parent and the child about, and again, I'm not talking about the escape artists, because that's, I think, going to be the whole next topic of conversation. I'm talking about just a neurotypical, I mean, we had a 2-year-old who was 68 pounds. And at first I thought, all right, let's just hope that weight is not accurate. Somebody please take this child inside and weigh them. And yeah, no, she was 68 pounds. She was also very tall. I mean, if I had to guess, over 40 inches tall. I mean, this was a very tall, and wide 2-year-old who was almost 3, if that makes anybody feel any better. She was already sitting in a booster seat. I just provided a better booster that gave more support, and it was good belt fit. She had the body proportions of a 4 or 5-year-old. And so the belt fit was appropriate. It was then just a question of her age and her maturity. And, would this work? Again, this child was already in a booster when they came to the check event. So, and this is a child who, honestly, it's 68 pounds and 2 years old, likely would not have, there was probably a reason she was already in a booster. And it's probably because she had already outgrown, her car seat. At some point you notice that you are stuffing your child into a seat and they just physically don't fit anymore. So, I asked Mom, I gave Mom my contact info. I asked her to follow up with me if the booster seat was not working. And often I don't hear back from these people. So I am left to assume that, the booster, and eventually they'll get older and they'll be more mature. We also then run into the older kids who physically don't fit in boosters anymore.
Yeah.
I still have a couple of incognitos that
Me too.
I hoarded before they got discontinued, and they have 10-year expiration dates on them. So I think they were made in 18. They're good till 28. I mean, I didn't love the incognito. Sorry, the lights just went out. But it served its purpose, and when you had a 7-year-old who was 110 pounds and wasn't really going to fit physically in anything else, the incognito was a nice option to have.
Same thing with boosters. I think a lot of times it comes down to that hip width and shoulder width.
And I've seen wider products, like the Diono Solana, right? Because it's wide and it's rated to 120. But when I've actually tried to use it for those 100-pound kids, it's not a great fit. And obviously, this is really going to be case by case. There may be other kids who do get good fit with that particular product, but it was not the solution that I was hoping for it to be.
Yeah.
A lot of times the child's lap, the top of their thighs, are taller than the armrests. So then you're like weaving the seatbelt, and I mean, sure, I can weave it, but I mean, is the child really
right? Are they going to do that every time?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Melissa, you say you have the Solana for your big kids, and is it working for you? I also found that the leg depth, or maybe like the waterfall, how it tapers, was uncomfortable for some of the kiddos that I tried it. But obviously you have it and you're using it, so I'm guessing that it's working for you. But
yeah,
gosh,
sometimes it's the shape too. I mean, sometimes it's a matter of you have to put their. I've definitely looked at seats and kids that I thought one thing was going to be a good fit, another thing wasn't. And by the time I actually put a tush in a seat, it looked quite differently. Sometimes it's just that shape, how it matches up. So I think, if you're in a situation where you have a wide variety of things to be able to try, that's really helpful. But certainly not always the case. I also sent my Frontier Click Tight to someone who needed it more than I did. It was one of those last ones standing. But yeah, I mean, I think it's true. We all need more options, and I'm hoping that manufacturers are working on them. But I can certainly understand the challenges. Melissa's saying it does work better than most others.
That's good. I'm going to hold up something that. Right. So this was the Combi Dakota, and this was the best big kid booster ever.
I think I fit in that.
So, I mean, both of my kids used it, once they were like in that 10 to 12 age range, but still needed it. It was, it was tapered, right? So it fit well between the seatbelt buckles, and the armrests were tall enough, and the depth was deep enough. And oh my goodness, I would give anything to have this product back for those bigger, older kids, or even honestly just for the bigger, younger kids who the problem with the Incognito was that it didn't really give you enough height, and it didn't have a shoulder belt adjuster. So yeah, it raised the child's height up a little bit, but what was that, like 2 inches, which was often really not enough to really get the belt fit that you would desire. So having something with more of a traditional booster height, but with the dimensions to actually be able to fit, a kid in the 100-pound range, that would be so huge to have that again. And we know it's possible because we had that design already. So Gary, I'm happy to lend it to you, and then you can 3D scan it, and then we'll push it to all the manufacturers and be like, here, take this gift.
Yep. No, let's I'm all for that. Let's pursue better things. That's what we should be doing. So yeah. Because again, there are those solutions to be found, right? And obviously, we're seeing a period now of kind of significant change. Really, obviously, we've got June this year, then obviously through end of 2026, and then we're thinking, obviously mentioned briefly earlier, type 2 belts and what that would do. And I don't think it'll be immediate because these things take time and there's a certain way. We talk about belt paths are fairly standardized and we need to think about that, but hopefully that will give us more leeway as designers to kind of think about these sorts of problems. And certainly in the space that kind of Shane and I are, we're always thinking about things like that.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to pivot to our last discussion point.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
sorry.
Let's talk about some very talented Houdinis. I mean, some of these
two.
I know. Yeah. So I mean, honestly, I'm always just super impressed by these children's ability to literally like the great Harry Houdini himself. Like these kids could be handcuffed and straitjacketed and somehow they still magically appear, So again, I always give props to these kids because, and some of them are double jointed, which just adds to the fun. But
when we're talking about disability, kids with lower muscle tone or, increased joint laxity, sometimes can move in ways that
you would not think was possible.
Right. Other physically typical children can. And that can present some extra challenge in addition to those fun escape artist tendencies.
And this is obviously something I think that we're all dealing with. We all get those emails and phone calls from desperate parents who just want to know, what seat is escape proof or what products that they can buy to keep their child from escaping the car seat. And I have learned from Louisa to ask those leading questions, sort of like, tell me what a car ride looks for your child. And what happens when they do escape. Some kids are just like, hi, Mom, and they appear next to you. And, and other kids are trying to open doors and open windows and
it was my kids who were trying to open the car doors.
Right. Yep. So, but even if your child is not trying to escape from the car moving down the highway, obviously it's a problem. A lot of people, and I understand that at that point as a parent, you're just exasperated and you just want the thing that's going to stop it.
It's scary.
Right.
It's scary when you're driving down the highway and all of a sudden your dome light comes on because you're, 18-month-old. Oh God, where they're. I'd like to be kidding, but I'm not. That was Twins version 1.
Were they 18 months when they started that?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. But I think, so look, we can talk about the products, and I saw Jason ask above too about Jason. I think you were asking about
aftermarket covers.
Yeah. But I think this always has to be a 2-part discussion because at the end of the day, a mechanical object, eventually they're going to figure out how to defeat that, whether that's, in 3 weeks or 3 months, or if we're talking about individuals who may have a disability that doesn't allow them to understand their own safety needs in a long-term sense, we can't just rely on mechanical restraint, right? It's got to kind of be a two-part solution. So we may need to look into those products, always we're going to start with, is the harness properly adjusted? Are those shoulder straps where they should be? Is it properly tightened? And from there we might look at, are different clips more difficult for them to do? What's that child actually seeking? Can we change the motivation? If we're getting out of our seat so we can access a chosen toy, if we're getting out our seat because there's some sensory input that's aversive or unpleasant, or because we're seeking something that's more pleasant, then we might want to address those on a behavioral level. Because ultimately, for all of our kids, someday they're going to figure out how to get out of all of the things. And if we're just relying on mechanical restraint and not also looking at a behavioral intervention, some kind of reward system, I always like to ask parents, so what works for your child when you're teaching them another skill? Because a lot of times those things will transfer. If we're talking about maybe a developmentally typical child, we might look at, what motivates them. Is there certain toys that could only be for the collar while you're buckled? Could there be rewards? Could we work on a chart? Could we, read some books about why this is important? For maybe a child who has some other developmental challenges, we might want to look at, what's kind of the function of this behavior, right? Are we seeking something? Are we avoiding something? Because then, while yes, we may need to use that anti-escape kit or something, in the meantime, we also need to be working on the skills for when that child either doesn't fit in that seat or has figured out kind of a way around that. So I think it's important not to ever just be like, oh, this is the thing that will lock the child in.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. Just to kind of follow up on that. First of all, quick fixes are really last resort, right? And this is something that's very, very, very important to remember always. And just to kind of build on, and Louisa has way more experience with doing this stuff than I am, but I think the first thing to think about always is that all behavior is communication. And when we're talking about neurodivergence and we're talking about things like sensory, non-verbal scenarios, something's being communicated. And the way that, a neurotypical person might interpret the sensory world, we have to consider sensory thresholds. Some people have very high sensory thresholds, so they go after things. Louise used the word seeking. Some people have very low, so they avoid. So it becomes a passive tactic, right? So they don't want to do something. And anything that kind of threatens that can kind of get in the way. So, I think the first step is always empathy, right? And as a CPST, you always want to think about, what is empathy, right? Empathy is gathering information, right? We're finding something out. So if a kid, for example, is in a booster seat and they're unbuckling the seatbelt all the time, what is it that's making them want to unbuckle, right? That's the first kind of question to ask. Ask the kid, right? If they're verbal, ask them, bring them into the conversation, empower them, right? As a CPST, we get that in the training at the end there. You're kind of working with the caregivers. Go back to that, right? And the child's just as important. Now, obviously, that can be more difficult. If the child's non-verbal, you might need social stories, you might need drawings, but the parent will know that. So you can empower the parent. And in that kind of empathy stage, kind of gather what it is. Because something like just being at the side of a vehicle could be that what we tune out as normal road noise could be like a small hallway, which is just so intense that they just want to get away from the window. And the seatbelt stops them getting as far away from the window as they might want. It might not be that. It might be that the pressure of the seatbelt is just a bit much, right? But for us, if you think of something, a condition maybe like kind of fibromyalgia, where, you touch something doesn't hurt, someone with fibromyalgia could really be painful because that kind of sensitivity is turned right up. So it's something like that where would it just, if you've got a kid maybe who's 9 and in a high back booster, maybe the seatbelt path would sit okay with a low back booster, but the pressure would not quite be the same because the belt guide's slightly different. If you move them into the middle, would the geometry of the seatbelts in the third row maybe make a difference to how that pressure felt? So you can work with all of that stuff first and really empowering and the empathy with it. But I think part of that kind of management of it, and certainly what we've seen at car seat checks, is setting kind of solutions and expectations that are actually realistic for both kid and parent, right? You can't obviously say to the kid, well, just don't buckle your seatbelt. That's not a realistic expectation. But it might be that the parent is kind of thinking, well, they're exhausted, as Keisha said, they don't want to do something. So what's their expectation? And how do you as a CPST facilitate that conversation as to what can be reasonably expected? So you might say, well, if we try something different, to the parent, maybe they think the high back booster is safer, which is a very natural way. We've probably all heard that. If a low back booster is going to be used and they're not going to unbuckle, is that then actually the safer, better option because it's the restraint that's going to be used correctly every time? So we're moving up that ladder, kind of good, better, best when we do it. But I think that kind of empathy, setting the expectations and defining the concerns is always the first mechanisms to go through. But always encourage the parent, right? If they've got that kind of anti-escape kind of thing going on, that's fine as plan A, but just don't reject the second part of being proactive about what the expectations have to be later and how you solve that to get away from having to use that. Because it's great to have, but you don't want to use it if you really don't want to. And I speak as someone with a company who produces that.
I mean, I'd agree. It's a both and solution. It's not a one or.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we scrolled up a bit ago, Jason had asked about, let me find it. He was asking about buckle covers purchased from Amazon as opposed to, a Merit product or something was specifically for that. And it sounds like he was asking, kind of thoughts on utilizing either product.
And I wanted to clarify too, Jason, if you're still with us, can you clarify if you were talking about a seatbelt buckle cover to keep the child from unbuckling, or were we talking about a buckle for the 5-point harness?
Because he said as opposed to the Merit product, I'm guessing he means the buckle guard. But
yeah.
Jason, if Jason wants to clarify.
I guess I don't spend a lot of time checking Amazon for these products, but I guess those sort of buckle covers exist, but they would have to be specific to the buckle style that you had. For example, the Merit product at the moment only works for an IMI buckle. So if you have that IMI buckle with that square button, then yes, there's a product that fits that. But I don't know. I'm just curious what's out there.
We would have done a just casual Amazon search just because it's fun to know what's out there. It definitely seems like there's some products that are sold or marketed as universal. You can slap it on anything.
Right.
And that alone would give me pause.
So yeah, Jason is saying it's the buckle guard. I mean, I would be reluctant. I certainly wouldn't recommend something that was aftermarket, and yet if it fit the product and was, I don't know, it's just one of those, it's a gray area. And Michaela mentions that there is a lot of products to prevent the chest clip from being lowered, and that is usually how the younger kids will escape. Like very often they don't have the fine motor skills or even the strength to unbuckle the buckle.
Right. It's you push it down and then you snake an arm out.
Yep. Yeah. And then once the top half is out, then it's not hard to get the rest of you free if that is your intention. Yeah. So Lois and I found a product last night that was from the UK that we were interested enough about it. Like we didn't think it was great. We thought it was really bad. But we were
thought it was terrible. But that's
trying to figure out like how much in US dollars is 46 pounds sterling, which was like the price with shipping.
We should have asked Gary. He probably would have known.
Well, we also
didn't even think of that.
Found a conversion tool online, and it came out to about $60 with shipping. And we were like, yeah, that's probably more than we want to spend just to gawk at a product. But we literally Googled like escape-proof car seat or something just to see what.
I think we were looking at AI and we wondered what AI would tell us because we were talking about like ChatGPT and all of these things that make me feel old when I acknowledge I don't entirely know how to use them. But yeah, AI had a very strong recommendation for us as to what would be like the escape-proof product to have. And it was definitely concerning. Gary, we'll send you the link if you want to see it. I don't want to give them a shout out.
I'm intrigued. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there are, products on the market. I have, besides the Merit product, I have not. I'm curious. I would have to read some of those reviews to see if people were actually getting a good result or if they were just promising. Yeah, because again, to a child who is determined, honestly, the Merit one is it's so low tech, but it's so brilliant. When it first came out, I was just mad that I didn't think of it first, but my brain doesn't work that way. But it's just so effective.
There was some interesting iterations of it before that we have lying around the office. I can tell you that it wasn't Shane's first go. There were ones with 10 inches worth of Velcro and zippers on them initially, so it took some time. But yeah.
But as far as whether or not those are reasonable options, I would be super hesitant just because of the stakes involved. I mean, not that I'm ever saying anyone should use an aftermarket anything, but I don't know. Look, I don't know. There's some things that might not give me as much panic as others, although I certainly wouldn't recommend them. But when we're talking about the potential for the child to be totally unsecured, I would really have a lot of pause in considering use of something from Amazon. And not to call it Amazon, but something other than a product specifically made and intended for that specific seat. Melissa was chiming in that that the universal claim is everywhere. Yeah, but we know they're not universal because we know there's really significant differences in the style. So I'd be very hesitant.
I did research something recently in trying to help a family. They were looking for something to cover the seatbelt buckle. And the mom had brought up something on Amazon, and I looked at it and I thought, all right, well, this seems like a fairly reasonable thing, right? And it seemed to have good reviews, and it was $12 or something. And I was like, if you want to give this a whirl and see if it solves your issue of removing access to the seatbelt buckle, obviously there was another way for you to unbuckle the seatbelt, but obviously I think it just limited the opening, so it was no longer, you couldn't just put your finger there and press. Again, that,
is this the one with all the slots that you're thinking about?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to.
I was just curious.
Go to Amazon.
Yeah, there's various designs of how they work. There's ones which work with things like kind of heavy layers of silicon because
this one was definitely
and there's ones, as you say, Louisa, that have slots or hole designed so you can kind of put a car key in, which we kind of joke now because if you've got a more modern vehicle, even though technically you still have to have the physical key, you generally don't have it. You might have a front door key, maybe that'll work.
Yeah.
But I think that with a lot of these things is, while the area of a seatbelt release buckle is mandated under FMVSS 208, the design of the buckle itself isn't. And one of the things that we've noticed with more and more of these, and the reason that you probably have to be hesitant, is if we go back 15 years, that's arbitrary, but thereabouts, we find a lot more what we call buckle stalks that are exposed in rear seats. With things like lie flat seats, fold flat cargo areas, things like this, particularly with the rise of SUVs, a lot more are now recessed into the seat. So are they going to fit, right? Can you even get them in? And I won't say too much, but we're designing something for the Roosevelt, actually, not specifically for the seatbelt, but to protect the actual. I may have shown you photos, Keisha Louise, of this, but it's a cover that goes around the side of the Roosevelt. And when we were looking into it, one of the things you have to bear in mind is that, does that affect the seatbelt beside it if you're talking about the center seat? Because you're always going to have two buckles and one buckle. So is that use of that buckle on one side going to affect the ability of someone else to exit the vehicle quickly? So you end up with a kind of chain of events moving along. So if you combine that with the recessed buckles and then the fact that you might not have the tool available, you're in a sort of a sticky scenario where you say, is it actually going to work? And then we're back to that problem. Michaela was talking about that kind of, it's a universal claim. It's another thing to be aware of. And the last thing I kind of say with it as well is that when you kind of reach those sorts of stages, for things like emergency scenarios, if that's really going to be the case, and there's something where it, is an accident and it's unconscious, there is going to be a seatbelt cutter involved. If it's a child in a child seat, if it's that serious, the seat will never have to be used again. And the EMTs will make the call. Do they remove the child in the seat? Do they have, if the seat damaged or whatever, but it's done its job, do they say, all that will be done and it will be disposed of. So it's a very sort of grey, very sticky area. But again, working with the parents, talking to people, making the judgment, seeing the vehicle. What vehicle do they have? Is it going to work? Is it going to upset something else in the vehicle? All of those things are going to inform your choice as CPST as to whether you can make it, because it might be like, oh, great, that's brilliant. And then you go to the vehicle, you go to the person's house, they turn up at a car seat check, recess belt buckles, the whole thing's pointless. So, it won't even work because it won't even fit. So, really getting involved with the kind of nitty gritty and understanding the vehicle and the child, etc., is really going to be a big chunk of making that decision for you. But again, as Louisa says, you have to be very hesitant about recommending these sorts of things.
I see Melissa's call out too about, when those escape behaviors then result in aggression in the vehicle. Obviously that can make a really dangerous situation for not just that individual, but for anyone in the vehicle. Listen, I think that's absolutely where, yes, we then may be looking at a anti-escape restraint device, but definitely we also want to be working with the behaviorist, PT, OT, all of the other providers that a child with those types of behaviors no doubt has working with them. Because that's a scary situation.
And again, speaking about, just to kind of build on that, Louise, as well, kind of thinking about that idea of kind of, is something going to be used correctly every time when we send them away? And not to kind of call out anything here, but obviously there are products like kind of, the anti-escape kind of safety vest types of ideas. But the installations of those each time, very time consuming and very challenging. And I personally have seen those come in where people have quite literally knotted some of the mounting straps around the stalks of the head restraint behind the seat, because it needs 2 or more people, to do that. So you're at that point where you're then starting to think, well, right, if I've got an OT with me, two CPSTs, myself, I'm at a car seat check and it's a Saturday afternoon, you might be able to get it right for that journey. Right. What's that going to look like on a Tuesday morning going to a doctor's appointment with a single parent?
Yeah. And then may the parent be less able to take that child out to have the community experiences they deserve, like every other child. If getting in the vehicle is a 20-minute 3 adults scenario, right? Then then it's not going to happen. The child's not going to have the same access to the community. And I think sometimes when we talk about, the escape artists, and I'm not talking about those, 2-year-olds where it's developmentally typical and that's what they do. But, older kids whose disability may not allow them to preserve their safety and are engaging in behaviors that may be dangerous in the vehicle, we also have to consider, what's that individual communicating, and what are we communicating back? I think unless you had the experience of being physically restrained as an adult or as an older teen, or having a device involving mechanical restraint used, sometimes we forget that can be a trauma to a child or an adult. It's a very scary experience to not be able to be in control of your own body. And obviously there's safety reasons why, there's sometimes that's what we need to do. But I really just like to take several steps back and consider that, this is an individual who's engaging in a behavior to communicate a need. As Gary called out earlier, whether or not I'm able to understand and find alternative ways to meet that need doesn't change, that's that individual's experience. And to just say that the solution is for me to take all the things because that makes it manageable, really is not respectful of that individual's dignity and that individual's personhood. So I think we just got to be really mindful when we're looking at some of those situations.
Yeah. And also, but also considering the exasperation of the parent, who is usually by the time they get to you at their wit's end. This behavior has persisted for weeks, months, who knows how many shoes have been, thrown out the back window. And, right. And I do wish oftentimes that we came in earlier in the situation, because a lot of times again, it's by the time they get to me, they're exasperated.
Sorry, Keisha.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And just because I absolutely hear you, and I agree 1,000% that we have to try to understand what the child is expressing, right? but at the same, yeah, it's a delicate balance.
I think it's a both and. It's not a one or.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I will, I want to always try to offer some helpful advice. And also, I would like to, before we wrap, I would like to talk a little bit about the process of obtaining an adaptive restraint, usually getting Medicaid or private insurance to pay for it, because I feel like a lot of CPSTs are not really aware of that process. It's not something that can happen overnight. But I do want to try to offer some practical solutions for you trying to understand what motivates the child. And also a lot of these children also have really specific interests. They could be hyper focused on trains, dinosaurs, flags of the world. And so for example, if you're trying to introduce a new car seat or booster seat, and it's not going well, as Melissa had that experience, because the initial reaction was not, a lot of kids are really attached to their blue seat. And then when you try to replace the blue seat with something else, a lot of times the reaction is not what you had hoped. But, could you order some stickers that are your child's favorite XYZ? Dinosaur stickers, flags of the world stickers, poop emoji stickers, like whatever your child loves, and then allow your child to put those stickers all over their seat. And then from that day on, you call it their poop seat. And they think
I am not calling it a poop seat.
Whatever works, right? It's your dinosaur seat. Hey, we're gonna go get some ice cream. Do you want to? Are you gonna ride in your dinosaur seat today? Like that might just do your best to make it.
Yeah, and sometimes when introducing those new things, like other things, we got to think about. Especially individuals on the neurodiverse spectrum may have a really strong need for sameness, and that change can be difficult. How do we introduce other new things, right? I mean, the idea that I'm just going to take your seat out and put this new seat that I think so much better in, and that's going to go really well, sometimes doesn't go that way. But what are the options? I mean, how can we do that preset? How can we expose them to that new thing, the seat, in a way that they're still comfortable? I mean, might we bring it in the living room and we sit in it for TV time for a while? Might we install it next to the existing seat and maybe we just ride around next to it for a week? Maybe we ride around next to it and then we let our stuffy sit in it. Maybe we ride around next to it and then we sit in that one for a second before we transition to our regular same one. It may just be a matter of being able to give one. I think it's really important to give our kids voice and choice in things. And right, we can't give them choice in everything. My own children would choose to never, ever brush their teeth again and only eat candy. But I give them the choices that are reasonable, right? So I might give them two choices, both of which are acceptable to me. Or I might say, yes, this is what we need to do. Do you want to do it now? Do you want to do it in 5 minutes? Do you want to stick the dinosaur stickers to it? Or do you want to stick I'm not going with the poop. What was the other option? Train? I'll go with that.
Trains.
Right. So the same may be true when we're introducing that new seat. Can the child select the color? We have some Roosevelts in my trading collection, but when my daughter saw Gary's purple Roosevelts, oh my God, that was life-changing. She still talks about how Gary has the purple one, and I think mine's like gray or something. It's not nearly as cool as Gary's. So can we give some choice in something like the color? Can we give some choice in the position it's sitting in the car? I don't know. Maybe we can give choice in that. Maybe we can't. But can we offer those other opportunities to have exposure to it, to have that practice, so we're not safe? Because the last thing we want to do is make a power struggle, right? No one ever wins at a power struggle. I teach some other areas of working with kids with disabilities, and a woman I was teaching with the other day said, power struggle is like wrestling with a pig. Everybody gets muddy and only the pig might enjoy it. And it took me a whole lot of time because I was not raised on a farm. But right, it just goes along. A power struggle, nobody wins. Parents are exasperated, so are kids. So what can we give as choice? What can we give as presets? Do we write a story about getting the new seat? Do we watch a video about somebody else getting a new seat? Do we slowly become accustomed to that seat? Do we watch YouTube videos of maybe another child using that seat? While mine is shipping to me, oh my goodness, let's see how this family's used it. Oh, so there's just so many options. Um, of how to do that in a more planful way.
Yeah, you definitely, full on creativity. What works for one kid won't work for the next, but you try all the things.
And you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. What's been successful for the child in other areas?
Right.
Because I know that at school or at, a doctor's visit or something, you've had to make other changes that maybe were not your child's first choice. So I think often deferring to that expertise of the parent, one, it reinforces, hey, we're a team. Parent, you and I are working together. It doesn't matter how many letters I have to have after my name. I've maybe spent, this much time with a child who a parent has spent this much. So how can we empower the parents to help come up with those solutions and be able to own them? Because it's not the first time they've had to change something on their child.
And and I think just to kind of build on that, Lou, as well, kind of thinking about, and I think we're all witnessing, unilateral decision making is never productive, and I think that collaboration is a key part of that, and setting expectations among yourself. As a CPST, this is something I'm kind of always kind of thinking about is, really unique arbiters of public health, right? You carry the knowledge of science with you. You carry the knowledge of public health with you. You carry the knowledge, sometimes medical knowledge, when we're talking about STAC, and with you as well. Now, you might not be a qualified doctor or anything, and that's fine. But that sense of empowerment and the collaboration is very important. But with the kid as well, right? If you can kind of talk to them, their parents know them, work with the parent when you're there and kind of get them involved in the decision making and setting expectations for the kid and the parent together as best as you can. And sometimes at a casting check, you don't get that. And I'm speaking slightly from a position of privilege because, we'll get emails in or someone will call me and I'll have 4 or 5 phone calls for over 5 days with them to kind of make that work. So, that's sometimes something you don't have. But that idea of collaboration where you set an expectation and the kid sets that expectation with their parents or with their caregiver, with their doctor, and they're part of that, is going to stand a lot more chance of preventing the kind of downstream exhaustion that Keith is so right to mention, right? So kind of being collaborative and having that empathy thing. And if you're ever kind of stuck there and don't think, go back to the empathy step, right? Kind of always kind of move back. Why is that C? Is it the color, as Keith just said, right? Is there something where you can put the sticker on the side of it, right? Is it its position in the vehicle, right? Is there something there? Because bear in mind, the way that, a neurotypical mind works does not process information. So you might have to always think, well, hang on a second, what am I missing? Could be something as just talking too loudly. We had an instance down at CHOP where we were helping with someone and we were trying different vests. It was the Churchill and the Chamberlain. And while we were talking, and we made a mistake, all of us, the kid picked up the vest, put it on, and they suddenly started smiling and they were happy. And they were a non-verbal kid. They just wanted to wear the vest, but we were thinking about the vest as part of the restraint and the car and how we were going to do it, because we didn't think, hang on a second, we just lost in the moment. We were all trying hard, but we lost ourselves in the moment. And we just, hang on, if we just gone back and said, let's just try it here. And that was it. And they solved it. And they leant back and the seatbelt, they just wore the vest. Didn't need anything else. It worked great for the rest of the time. But again, it's because we sort of made the mistake of missing, go back to that empathy point, right? How can I keep the empathy, sensory, behavioral, whatever it happens to be? And the empathy is the key to the collaboration, which I think can solve some of that exhaustion later on. And won't always work. You can't look at things in rose-tinted spectacles, but a lot of the time it's what's going to give you the chance of getting the best solution and causing less exhaustion later when you can find it. So again, empathy leads to collaboration, I think, is what I'm broadly saying here.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
I do think it's worth mentioning that Evenflow now approves, excuse me, my voice. Evenflow now approves the use of the chest clip guard with their harnessed seats. I don't think I don't think the Revolve, because I don't think Revolve gives you access to the splitter plate, but I know Sonos, Titan 65.
Maestro Sport.
What was the other one?
Maestro Sport.
Yeah.
Maestro. Okay. Yes.
That's a whole lot of options that we didn't have a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah.
cool.
I mean, it doesn't help if the kid is able to unbuckle the buckle.
Working on that.
Good. Glad to hear that. Because this definitely opens up some possibilities of using the chest clip guard on the buckle guard on a more price point accessible conventional seat, as long as your child is, significant, at least, with Maestro only goes to 50, but both Sonos and Titan 65 have 65-pound versions. Yeah, and that's huge, and I would love to see more of the conventional manufacturers picking that up. I'm curious if anyone has some parting thoughts on, has anyone personally used the chest clip guard and or buckle guard on other conventional seats that were not made by Evenflow? I know I have. And again, it's about access to the splitter plate. Not every product gives you access to the splitter plate.
I mean, there's been times that I haven't been comfortable recommending something because but I've had a discussion with a parent who live in a very gray area of this is the this is the solution you've come up with. Let's consider this. Let's consider this. These are the cost benefit. And at the end of the day, just like regular car seating, who makes that decision?
Right.
Yeah. I see a call out of someone who's seen them on the MyFit and the Frontier.
Yeah, I haven't done it on the Frontier, although the Frontier I felt like would be a good option, but I was concerned because the Frontier required the hugs pads.
Yeah.
And I would have had to have removed the hugs pads to use the chest clip guard. So it wasn't my first choice, but
you've got me intrigued now. I'm going to see if I can try it on the Frontier I've got and see if there is a way around that, but I'll for another time.
And again, you figured that the hugs pads were there for a reason.
Yeah.
And if the kid was close to the upper limits of the seat, I was nervous about taking them off. But I mean, the product is incredibly effective. I will give it that. And I love the video. I think it's Shane's daughter in the video, right? And she's trying to get out of it. And at the end, she makes this face like, but she can't. And it's so cute. Makes me laugh. But it is incredibly effective. Gary, has there been instances of kids who've been able to access the buckle, even with the buckle guard on it?
Not really. No, the buckle guard, put it this way, it's always that classic misuse question. So what we get, and I can tell you that we've seen them on all kinds of range of seats from what we get in the emails, but and we also sell an awful lot of them for special needs strollers.
So I've seen it once or twice, but you've also solved the problem with a child who has the mobility to hit that A-lock, loosen the straps, and then be able to lean far enough. But I know that you have a remedy for that. But that's the only time I've seen that.
Yeah, and this is a really great point actually as well. And again, not when I'm got my stacked CPST hat on here, not necessarily my merit hat, but obviously they're crossover. But I should say that there is something called an A-lock guard as well for the Roosevelt, which we sell. It's a slightly different product. It has to be installed. We can install it on seats that are already out there, but we need the seat back, which isn't ideal, but that is an option, and that requires uses the same key for the buckle guard, which we have a new key very close in the works as well, more user friendly sort of key. So something I'm working on. But what we generally see with the buckle guard in terms of its uses is if it's used correctly, it's fine. And typical misuse is not putting the neck strap behind so it gets pushed down. That's a classic one. So making sure it's at the right height, making those adjusters where they are. We occasionally see things where it's not adjusted correctly in the sense that one of the set screws is loose, and that can happen. That's much, much rarer. But when it is used, generally it's very, very effective. And in terms of the buckle guard, the only things we ever had are where toys are left around. Toy helicopter blades, particularly effective. So just make sure, if you're in one of those scenarios in CPST, just check the car, arm's reach, just take the toy helicopters away because the blades are pretty good. So, avoid those. But generally speaking, we have very, very, very few instances. And again, those that are happening generally are just because of an adjustment issue. Once we advise that, and something we often do is, we have shared folders where people can send this to us. Sometimes it's through the suppliers, where people, the kind of distributors will kind of work with us because they've got OTs who work with the patient. Sometimes it's directly a parent. We're happy to do either way. But generally speaking, buckle guard is sound. The most misuse comes with a chest clip guard, but that's mainly just if the strap isn't behind the neck. Other than that, they're pretty solid.
Yeah. And Michaela's also calling out that she knows a tech whose child learned to stick toys into and open the buckle.
Michaela, you're absolutely right. It can happen. And it's
children, gotta give credit where credit is due. I mean, these children have incredible problem-solving skills.
Yes.
And it's awesome when you can conceptualize it that way. Sometimes that's difficult for an exasperated parent.
Right.
And just to answer another question, Keisha, I know kind of you brought up there as well. The seatbelt buckles we were talking about earlier as well. Generally speaking, we always recommend if you've got a Roosevelt, install it with a long belt path if you can. Does away with knee with a tether, much more simple. But there have been supposed cases of children reaching around the side and unbuckling the seatbelt, which has installed the seat itself. We have a product that will kind of get around that we're kind of very close to kind of finishing on. But one of the ways to do that is just change the belt path. Go with the short belt path, and depending on the seat, that will bring the buckle further behind the seat. The angles change. It's not accessible. Techniques like that can kind of help. With the Churchill and the Chamberlain, it's much more of a challenge because obviously that's something that we're kind of working on. And again, Churchill, it's hard to say exactly, but about kind of 50% of the vest, so it's not really an issue because it's a postural thing. But when you've got the positioning harness in there as well, then you do occasionally get that. And we are working on that. It's a tricky solution because you've got to respect the vehicle manufacturer's wishes regarding the seatbelt as well. Because on one end of the spectrum for design, you could just say that installation of a child seat is misuse of a vehicle seatbelt. If a manufacturer really wanted to push that point, there's an argument they can make it. No one's ever going to do that, right? Because it's tough. No one's ever going to go around, don't protect your kids. That's silly. Break the law. Don't put them in charge. They're never going to say that. But with this sort of stack thing, you get in that grey area again, where it's like you can make something that's going to do that, but that's going against the vehicle manufacturer's recommendations. So you have to respect both the child seat manufacturer and the vehicle manufacturer's recommendations when you're developing products in this way. And that can be a real challenge. But we're kind of working on, thinking about the Churchill and the Chamberlain. But I'll be the first to admit this. It's a particularly difficult challenge. And I've certainly gone through my fair share of PLA with 3D printing ideas. And some are better than others. But it's still a work in progress. But we are working on that. And we always say that if that's a situation, either if it's a merit product, please call us. We won't hesitate to do that. If not, if there's another product as Stack CPSTs, we'll do it whatever we can to work with you with the product that you have and figure that out. And I certainly will do that. I'm not going to, just stick with merit stuff. I do everything. So, that's certainly one of those things where it's a case by case, figure it out and go back to what we were saying earlier about that kind of what's the behavior communicating and how we work through it. And that's where we go back for that issue.
Yes. Okay. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't touched on today? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. We have a lack of products at this point to keep bigger, younger kids, or even just bigger, more immature kids harnessed. That is a problem that we will continue to deal with until some manufacturer decides to, I don't want to give
a new challenge.
And I don't want to give anyone a false promise of hope, but with the sunsetting of testing with type 1 belts. I'm hoping that opens the door to a manufacturer who's willing to spend the money on extra testing. That's really what it's going to come down to. Do they think it's worth the extra whatever they have to spend to get their seats to test and pass with the 10-year-old? But I do hope that some manufacturer is willing to go there. And I do think that they will be rewarded if they do that. I think people would really flock, as long as it wasn't a really prohibited price. We don't need any more $500 car seats. Conventional car seats. We have enough of those. Thank you. They're lovely. But if somebody could come up with something in the $300 price range that would harness back up to 80 pounds at least, that'd be
huge.
Huge. And so I can only hope. We've seen a lot of things in 20 years, and so I'm hoping that we will see. Melissa says she was also wondering if type 1 going away. That was my first thought when I read about that change. I was like, okay, maybe we can have some higher weight harness seats back again, please. So we'll see. Time will tell. And I think, just to summarize, when you have an escape artist, really try to ask those leading questions, try to understand the child's motivation and what they're trying to communicate. Because you can't just work on the behavior without working on the root of the behavior. So if nothing else, but that takes time, and it takes conversation, and it takes empathy, and it takes creativity. And again, what works for kid A will not work for kid B or C, but you'll just keep trying until, and I know that for some kids an iPad can be distracting enough, but for short rides, right? Like getting your kid to sit and stay buckled for a 15-minute ride to the grocery store, is sometimes more of an attainable goal. But, an iPad, some kids can entertain themselves for hours with an iPad, but a lot of kids will lose interest in something after 5 or 10 minutes, and then the iPad gets flung, at somebody, and the challenge is just longer rides. Yeah. Also, you don't want to get hit with a flying iPad.
Nope.
So maybe
shoes,
tether it to something.
Cups.
Right. Yeah. All of
Ugly.
those things when flung with, even with the force of a 5-year-old can do some damage. So we just have to keep trying. We just have to keep reaching out to our community. And sometimes parents are just so grateful to encounter somebody who actually cares to listen and to try to problem solve, because sometimes these people, everyone just needs a friend. Sometimes someone that you can talk to who will not judge you, who understands that you are at your wit's end, and just supporting these parents with empathy and kindness. And sorry, that's all I got. Be nice.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to be here, and appreciate the invite, and hopefully people found it helpful. But thank you very much, Keisha. And
yes, thank you. And we really do hope to continue to have more of these live streams where we talk about topics that are important to the CPS community and really just to parents everywhere. Eventually, we're going to do some fun topics. Not that.
What do you mean this isn't a fun topic?
I was say, not that this isn't a fun topic, but it's a serious topic. And eventually, when we thought about doing these live streams, we envisioned them to be like fun Friday night happy hour, things, and then we just started picking some hard-hitting subjects. But tell us what you would
So
like.
invite us for the fun happy hour ones too.
Yeah.
We're fun.
So we would. I think we're gonna do some fun, fireside chats. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone. And if you have some ideas,
thank you all.
Or you want to be a guest speaker on a future live stream, reach out or put a comment in the chat. But we will definitely be planning more of these because I think it's important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. I hope you have some fun plans. And I think we're going to try to create a resource document that once that's done, we will put a link to it in the comments. And for sure, we'll be posting it on thecarseatpros.com. So if you haven't already, please like us and follow us, and especially here on YouTube and Instagram. We appreciate all your support. Thank you for everything that you guys are doing in your communities.
Yes. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, agreed. All right, I love you guys very much. I'm going to end the stream now. Ciao.
Bye.